If we can call this meeting to order, please. Thank you. I'd like to call to order the study session for the City Council for the City of Wheat Ridge, Colorado for December 16th, 2019. Our first order of business will be citizen comment on agenda items. And I have several people signed up to speak. And when I call your name, if you'd come to the podium and adjust the microphone so that it's convenient for you. And give us your first name and last name, and if you'd spell your last name for the record, and give us your address. You'll have 3 minutes, and so when you start speaking, the clerk will set the timer, and when the green light starts to blink, you have 30 seconds left, and when the orange light comes on, you have 15 seconds left, and then when the red light comes on, your time is over, and if you would conclude your remarks. Our first speaker is Mo Keller and Steve Keller on deck.
Hi, good evening. My name is Mo Keller, Keller, and I live at 4325 Iris Street. And I'm here this evening with some of my neighbors. We're interested in the noise ordinance. We very much appreciate your taking up this issue because for the last 7 years we have had problems with a business in our neighborhood who has live music, often very loud. And so we have done a few things. We've tried mediation that Chief Brennan had established for us. We actually had 2 mediations with this particular business. And so looking at the noise ordinance we think could be very helpful and supportive for us as a community. There's 2 ways that you can go. One would be a subjective. When someone comes, we call the police. We call them almost every weekend. They come out and they will give it their best interpretation. Or you can have a decibel measure. And the decibel reading measure can be a benefit to us because it would support us in terms of a business or anyone else having loud music above that threshold. On the other hand, it could hurt us in that if the decibel level is established as such, let's say 50, 55 dB or whatever, and that's still very loud, then we don't have any recourse to be able to work with the business to say, please lower the volume. So we don't know. Our problem at this point is we don't know what that volume level would be and what it would sound like in front of our homes. And I don't know if we can measure that before you progress so that we can be somewhat assured that whatever the volume level, if you do move in the direction of a decibel reading that you might want to lock into an ordinance, that would be sufficient and would be beneficial to us so that we would have some comfort back in our neighborhood from being bombarded with loud music. So whatever direction you go in, but we're happy to help you out. We're happy to consult with you and visit with you and help you with the ordinance depending on where you go with it. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Steve Keller and Linda Dillon on deck.
Steve Keller, also at 4325 Iris Street. My wife and I have been Wheat Ridge residents since 1975. Oh, that's also Keller, just like Mo's. We are speaking for 5 households, all within 1 block south of a business located at the corner of Independence and 44th Avenue, with which we have had intermittent and ongoing problems with noise since 2012. I do thank the mayor and the council for giving us the opportunity to speak to this and for also considering a revision of the noise ordinance, which I understand currently is of a subjective nature and based on the perception of a reasonable person being disturbed or not disturbed by noise ordinance. I would suggest that, as Mo also suggested, that the council consider carefully what the noise threshold might be. Perhaps even consider bringing in a consultant. Of course, I'm sure you're looking at other cities' noise ordinances. Perhaps even looking at other cities' PDs to see how they enforce a noise ordinance that might be objective or decibel based. There was another point I wanted to make. Well, anyway, I want to reiterate a point that Mo made. The current subjective nature of the ordinance, I admit, is kind of fuzzy. I mean, what is a reasonable person? When is a reasonable person disturbed by noise? An objective level would be to our advantage if it is such that it curtails a potential noise nuisance. So anyway, thanks again, and I appreciate your considering the issue.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Linda Dillon.
Good evening. My name is Linda Dillon, and I would like to speak to a different side of this. I'd like to speak to the problem of landscape equipment noise pollution. Leaf blowers specifically are a huge contributor to noise pollution in Wheat Ridge. Take a walk on any nice day during the year and someone somewhere will be running a leaf blower. In a half an hour, a leaf blower provides the same amount of pollution as driving 3,900 miles from Texas to Alaska in a Raptor. It adds 500 times as much hydrocarbons, 46 times more particulate, and 26 times more carbon monoxide. OSHA requires people who run leaf blowers professionally to have safety gear such as respirators and ear protection. But if you're just in the proximity, say 50 feet, that is 78 decibels. Above 85 can cause permanent damage. Decibels are measured on a logarithmic scale, meaning every increase of 10 decibels is equivalent to a 10-fold increase in sound intensity. Noise heightens stress levels, impairs concentration, disrupts sleep, and leads to hypertension and heart disease. It can even have negative impacts on a fetus. The CIA uses noise to torture prisoners. The EPA tells us that high levels of frustration and aggression caused by noise last even when the noise has ceased. Weed whackers run at 96 decibels and hedge trimmers at 103 and can be heard a half a mile away. A chainsaw is 115 and a siren is 120 decibels. The high frequency noise that the leaf blower provides is so extremely irritating that many cities in the US now ban them altogether. Maintenance workers, maintenance workers who protested that it would take 2 times as long to do the work without them were proved wrong by a grandmother using a rake and a broom. Sweeping is actually more efficient. Leaf blowers blast out 180 mile per hour wind that damages young plants, obliterates topsoil, and carries away mulch. They stir up dust and particulate matter that can aggravate asthma and other respiratory ailments. It contains mold, pollen, pesticides, animal feces, arsenic, mercury, and hydrocarbons. The manufacturers of landscape equipment employ full-time lobbyists to quiet anti-blower legislation. I would like to have excessive noise from landscape equipment banned in Wheat Ridge. I would like to walk in my beautiful neighborhood without being subjected to this harmful and unnecessary pollution. The EPA is calling environmental noise the new secondhand smoke, and I agree. I have a neighbor who runs this type of equipment for up to 6 hours a day, 5 to 6 days a week during the summer and fall. I would very much like relief from this noise pollution. I have asthma, and it very much does aggravate my illness. I would like to take this a step further and follow some cities' new initiatives to reward residents who choose another way to landscape. By not having the traditional lawn that sucks up water and constantly needs pesticides, fertilizers, and other poisons, having natural landscape is beneficial in many ways. Planting native wildflowers and plants encourages butterflies, bees, and birds instead of killing them with poisons. Anyone who grows vegetables will appreciate the yield of garden pollination by these creatures. Instead of looking out on a sterile, even toxic yard, look out on a gentle, varied landscape and do the entire earth a huge favor. It would be wonderful if Wheat Ridge could get out in front of this issue and be a true leader for Colorado. This is from the Boston Globe and the Miami Herald. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are all of the speakers that I have signed up to speak. Is there anyone here who is not signed up to speak that would like to speak at this time? You may come forward. And I don't see anybody coming, so we will close our citizen comment. Thank you all for coming. for that, and we will go to agenda item number 1. This is the loan agreement between the City of Wheat Ridge and the Wheat Ridge Urban Renewal Authority. Mr. Goff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Steve Art, the Executive Director of the Wheat Ridge Urban Renewal Authority. Tonight we come before you to ask for consensus to assist with Renewal Wheat Ridge in helping to fund improvements at the Gold Shopping Center, located at the northwest corner of 26th Avenue and Kipling Street. On November 19th, just this last month, the Urban Renewal Authority approved a development agreement, a redevelopment agreement with the center to provide them funding of just a little over $1.5 million for the improvements to that center. I have the project proponent, Adam Radcliffe, here tonight, who can talk to you about specifics that are going to happen within the shopping center. But as far as city improvements, we have been working and struggling with the center for approximately 4 years since the Golds closed down that center in 2015. It was then purchased immediately by West Side Development, who did some improvements to the facade of the building. They received a loan from Wheat Ridge Business District, Wheat Ridge Local Works to do some facade improvements, but really struggled with finding tenants for the building and doing some major improvements in there. We've struggled with how to fund improvements to put in curb, gutter, sidewalk, and some landscaping on that project. We were then very excited when approximately 6 to 8 months ago, Adam approached us as a potential new purchaser of that shopping center. With that, he would like to do some major improvements to the center. So to talk about the streetscapes, this loan will enable us to put curb, gutter, sidewalk on the frontage of that along 26th Avenue and along Kipling Street. That will be able to now provide those neighbors that are to the west of the shopping center ease of access to that shopping center, as well as to Gold Crown Hill Park, and make it easier for people to move in and out of that shopping center. There will be a landscape buffer that will be added in there to create some safety between those pedestrians on the street and the traffic moving down 26th Avenue. A bus stop will be maintained at the center along 26th Avenue. Adam will redo the entire parking lot to the center, as well as other improvements. And I'd like to invite Adam up here right now. He has a presentation to show you. Mr. Goff, if we can get that. So what we are going to be asking this evening is for the City Council to provide a consensus to help fund this with a loan to Renewal Wheat Ridge of $500,000 that we would like to have paid back in a period of approximately 5 years. So the city would actually be taking active part in this by providing the loan to Renewal Wheat Ridge, of which we would repay. Mr. Radcliffe, it's all yours.
Thank you, Steve. Could you please turn the lights off? Thank you.
I'm going to do my best here with one arm.
And would you give us your name and address, please?
Adam Radcliffe, not a member of the Wheat Ridge community, but 4441 Vallejo Street, Denver. Let's see. So hopefully many of you are familiar with the Paramount Heights Shopping Center at 26th and Kipling. Most folks in town, as I've come to learn, don't really know what the name of the shopping center is, whether it's Gold's Grocery or the Paramount Bowl Center or just that naked, ugly, landscapeless, half-empty shopping center at the northwest corner of 26th and Kipling that used to have Gold's Grocer and a really fun bowling alley in it. As Steve mentioned, I came across this property perhaps 6 months ago and started researching the community and the market. And what I realized was the city of Wheat Ridge did not have a unique, authentic destination. You could go to Teller's and get a great burger. There were some great local restaurants, but what was lacking was a real sense of place where community could not only go, but thrive, where the tenants that are in the center that do well could do better. And a lot of this could be achieved with just some thoughtful redesigning of the shopping center And so the real vision, if you will, was to create something new out of something that existed currently, an iconic shopping center that most people recognize from the signage, but perhaps don't know the name. So the idea, again, was how do we take what was built in 1958, 1960, and 1962, and take it from where it is today, which looks a bit like this, and bring a little bit more of a sense of place to it. As Steve mentioned, my partners and I will be investing significantly in landscaping, right-of-way improvements, streetscape, architectural improvements, signage, and a very tailored leasing plan to focus on strong local operators that we feel fit what the community is looking for. We see this as a destination for the city of Wheat Ridge, in the city of Wheat Ridge, because right now the surrounding neighborhood has nowhere to go if they want to go on a date night, to take their kids somewhere for a walk in the neighborhood, someplace to go for a cup of coffee. Council members, if we were to meet for coffee at the center, it would not be possible because, as I'm sure you know, there is no coffee shop there. It's probably the only retail center I've ever been to in my career that doesn't have a coffee coffee shop. Although you could go across the street into Lakewood at Lube and Latte, which is a car service center that also is a purveyor of coffee. So this is the general idea of what we're looking to achieve here. Adding color, adding new areas to gather and connect, and recently PwC issues an annual emerging trends in real estate report, and there was a new term that I read about that tends to get a laugh, and sometimes my wife rolls her eyes at me when I bring this up, but the idea was, it's called hipsterbia. And forgive the term, but as we all know, growth in real estate happens cyclically. And what we're seeing is millennials today are starting to have kids, and with that, they're choosing to move from the inner ring to suburbia, if you will. But what they don't want is they don't want to give up all of the great amenities that they had when they lived in the city. They don't want to give up the great food, the experiences, the sense of community. And so this idea of hipsterbia is, how do we take a suburban shopping center like this and lease it to very specialized, tailored retailers that we are handpicking? There will be no national tenant chains here. Patrick loves my joke. There will be no Easy Pawn here, even though I know zoning would not allow it. But this is really the core of what we're trying to achieve here, is create a destination where community can come together and thrive. And this rendering here, you see some of the landscape improvements that Steve mentioned, some areas of common area gathering space where we feel it's important. People should be able to come with their dog in the summer or the fall, grab a cup of coffee, sit out on a picnic table, and enjoy their time outside. That's why we all live in Colorado. We also want to embrace what's there today, which is what's referred to as a Googie style of architecture. Not Google, but Googie style of architecture, which is fun, retro, a little more colorful and vibrant, a little more whimsical. Something that, it's not novel, it's not cheap, but it's thoughtful, and it's hearkening back to what this center once was. I just found out today, actually, that the Wheat Ridge Library used to be at this center back right after it was built, along with the local Red Cross. So the center has amazing history, and then we're really trying to just take that history and build onto it. And as you'll see here, we want to keep and reflect upon the legacy that Bob Gold and Joanne Gold built here by retaining the sign, renaming the property Gold's Marketplace, making sure that people going forward don't have any confusion about what this property is called or what this destination is known as. there's not going to be confusion about Paramount Heights or Gold Center. From the day of grand opening, and hopefully for a very long time thereafter, this will be known as Gold's Marketplace. And we hope that the tenants that are there will continue to do even better, and we'll be able to lure new tenants there, exciting new tenants that the neighborhood will appreciate and will be embraced by the neighborhood. So with that, what we've kind of put together here is a values chart of what we think are the most important ideas, concepts, beliefs that will be the drivers of this project, that will be in the back of our minds as owners for the long term, to ensure that this is a true community asset, something that we can be proud of, and something that the city and Renewal Wheat Ridge will never regret investing in. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Steve, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. So it's an exciting project. He has a great group of investors. One of the things we did not mention also, that is the key gateway into our community. So at the hard corner of 26th and Kipling, the city would put in one of its monument signs there at that corner. It's in our CIP budget, so that will be funded by the city but installed by the project itself. With that, council members, we'd be happy to answer any questions that you would have and hope that you would provide a consensus for us to move forward to bring an agreement with you at a future meeting.
Okay, thank you very much for a nice presentation. Appreciate it. We'll open this up for questions from council. Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As it relates to the $500,000 loan, it indicates that the repayment would begin in 2021. And so would that be the beginning of a 5-year repayment plan, or
Correct.
does the 5-year start now?
So payment by 2026 then.
So what would be the revenue generated to pay back this loan? Or what
It would be increment received from all the other projects. So this is within the I-70 Kipling Corridor Urban Renewal Plan area that really pretty much runs from Clear Creek Crossing up to the TOD station, over to Kipling, all the way down to the center at 26. So pretty much the revenues generated by the Kipling Ridge Shopping Center would help obligate this debt.
And then, so the funds that the city of Wheat Ridge gives on an annual basis to Renewal Wheat Ridge wouldn't go to repay this?
Yes, a portion of it would.
Okay.
The one that goes into the general fund, the 300,000 was what you're referencing, correct?
Right.
Yes, a portion of that would be dedicated toward that.
So over a 5-year period, wouldn't we just reduce the amount that we're giving to the renewal authority by that amount to pay us back? Why make it more complicated than that?
If that's what the council would choose to do, I don't think we have any problem. Although that money goes into the general fund, we have different accounts within urban renewal. We would like to obligate some of that back from monies that is generated from that project area itself, which we think the majority of that 500,000 repayment would come from that area.
Okay.
Additional questions? Ms. Hulteen?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First of all, I'm just really excited to see the details of this project. I think this is the kind of project that, if we could dream up what happened there, it would look a lot like this. So thank you for bringing that vision to our community. I have a couple of questions. So the loan is being proposed because the Renewal Wheat Ridge funds are running towards depletion, or can you just give a little bit more background on why the loan is needed?
It would stretch us very thin in urban renewal. We've been able to do so many other activities in our urban renewal plan areas, stoplights that we have put in, assistance with other areas that don't create any TIF but want to put a new facelift on there. So it would just stretch our funds real thin, that we may not be able to do some activities that council, our urban renewal board deem this would be something we really like to do. Gee, we just don't have the funds. So it would just assist us in doing that. Again, we originally had proposed out that this would be, the city would participate, but I came back and said, let's do it as a loan. We are generating those revenues over time that we can pay the city back.
Thank you. So so being able to do this then would keep us in a position to be able to move forward with other opportunities that might arise after this. Is that correct?
Yes, Councilwoman.
Okay, thank you. And then one more question. It's a little bit more on the technical side and maybe not appropriate here, but has anyone been in contact with Lakewood about repairing the entire corner to make sure that Lakewood's corner is also ADA accessible as part of processes like these?
We have not. Something we can always always do. We can reach out to them and let them know the plans for our side of the street and see if they want to participate, but we have not at this point in time.
I think it's important. It's a really critical corner. It's not just a gateway corner for our city, but Lake Woods as well. And with all the traffic that comes through there, both vehicularly and also through the Crown Hill, I think really making sure that that whole intersection works for everyone who needs to use it. If we're going to invest that much, it would be good to reach out and encourage Lakewood to take a look at it too. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional questions? Ms. Dozeman?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. How many existing businesses are on that property still?
About 6.
Will they have the opportunity to stay, or are you planning on bringing in all new businesses in that area?
One of our main objectives is to encourage existing tenants to stay and help them become more successful. So in addition to that, all of these tenants have existing leases that have term, that even if we were to come in and choose that, which is not the case, but if we were to come in and choose that they weren't the right fit, they still do have term on their lease. But with that said, we're excited about the tenants here, and they all have something unique to provide, and that was one of the aspects that drew us to this property in particular, was those individual tenants and the unique niche that they fill and that we feel is somewhat Amazon resistant, if you will.
Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Art. So this loan, can you just discuss what the money would go towards as far as urban renewal? Is it mostly remediation, or how do you see those funds being?
The bulk of it would go for the curb, the gutter, the sidewalk, and the landscaping. Public improvements, the HVAC units, and every one of those units is that 1950 with a drop-down heater, space heater inside there. He's going to replace that all, run ducting in there, so it'll do that. But the majority will be the curb, the gutter, the sidewalk, and the landscaping. Within the agreement that we did approve, there's a list of all those improvements.
Thank you. Ms. Nosler-Beck.
Thanks, Mayor. And I just wanted to say thanks to Adam. Before I was elected to council, was on urban renewal, and so I've seen the presentation a couple times. And just to jump on a couple of comments that were, or questions that were asked, specifically with the safety of that corner, this project will, one thing that happens all the time up there is that cars use that parking lot as a cut through, or pedestrians use it, and then you end up with people just in really dangerous situations, and they're usually speeding to try and get there. And it's just such a nasty corner. And so with the plan that Adam's put together, it stops that from happening. It's not accessible anymore to do that. So that's a great use of the landscaping and the curb and gutter. But then also Adam had a few owners of the company, of the businesses located within the center right now come in and speak to how much they're looking forward to the actual project moving forward. And that's great for making sure that we're investing in the businesses in our community. So I really support this project.
Thank you. Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess as we're being presented this, I think these plans look great, but they've got nothing to do with this loan, and this loan is to the Urban Renewal Authority for $500,000, so that they aren't stretched thin. It doesn't say exactly what this particular $500,000 is going to go to, and I don't see why the Urban Renewal Authority, at the time that they need additional cash, couldn't come to us for a loan. So I guess that would be my first question is, at the time that you would need this further money, because this particular $500,000 isn't going into this project, it's that this project is being covered by current Urban Renewal Authority funds.
No,
correct?
we would obligate the loan to this project. We'd be more than happy to set up a separate account if you would like that would then obligate that loan money dedicated specifically to this project.
So the $500,000 is in addition to the Urban Renewal Authority agreement, or is it part of the Urban Renewal Authority agreement?
It would supplement.
It's part of the 1.6 that they're asking for. Adam and his team are asking. We did a pro forma and looked at what their gap was in financing to make this feasible for them. And the number that they came up with was 1.58 million. So as Steve mentioned, the Urban Renewal Authority doesn't have quite 1.58 million. So with the additional loan from the city of 500,000, they can provide this funding up front to Outpost, so that they need this funding up front to make this project work. Typically, a lot of times with our urban renewal projects, we can pay back developers over time with the increment that's generated from the site with new sales tax or new property tax. But they need the 1.6 up front to make all these improvements to expand the spaces for the tenants, to put in the landscaping, put in the curb and gutter. So, you know, we did talk to them about if they could spread the money out over time, but really to make this happen, they have to have it up front to get all this work done.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hoppy?
Thank you for your presentation and for being here. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would just like to point out that the total eligible URA costs, the total cost that the Urban Renewal Authority can assist with is $3,277,486. So the request of the $1,583,547 is only 48% of what the total eligible costs are. I know how with our different urban renewal areas, they'll kind of have their own funds and their own dollars, and the general fund is a very small amount of money, but that's so that we can try to help float some different projects in different areas. And so that's why this loan is important. And so I'm in support of it. I look forward to seeing something happen on that property, because I was on the board of Local Works. I was on the board of Wheat Ridge Business District. Like, I've seen people talking about this project for a long time, and so I would be very happy to see something happen with it.
Thank you. Additional discussion, questions? Ms. Dozman?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So after this loan and the agreement with the URA, do you plan to come back for any other subsidies for the project?
No.
Okay. And then let me see if I can just find it. The project partners, Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, Schreck. I recognize that name. Can you maybe discuss some of the other projects that they have worked along our city with? I don't know if that's a question for staff or.
That's my legal counsel, and
Okay.
Steve may be able to.
They're Brownstein Hyatt Farber's a very large firm, and they specialize in real estate land deals. So, yeah, they've worked in Wheat Ridge on numerous projects. Clear Creek Crossing, one of them.
Are they the same firm that
38.
sued us because of the TIF 300? Did they?
No.
Sued us because of TIF for the
The
ballot
TIF,
question
yes,
300.
ballot question
I don't
300.
think a law firm would have sued us. They may have
You may have
represented
represented,
somebody,
right.
but yeah, law
And that's
firm
what I
would.
was, because that's
Yeah.
I think where I recognize the name from, and I was just
Yeah,
wondering if.
they may have been involved in that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You may want to. Could you, Adam, just briefly talk about your other partners, because I think they're fairly significant in the projects they've worked on.
Yeah, absolutely. So Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, Schreck, they are legal counsel. They are experts in terms of public-private partnerships, and are aiding me on the acquisition of the property from a legal counsel standpoint. The additional partners are Quana, which is a private equity real estate firm that is the capital provider behind this project. Local firm, 2 individuals, and a very thoughtful investment approach. Design Edge, the architect, they've done numerous retail projects, numerous office, numerous luxury condo projects around Denver and the metro area. And then White Construction Group, most notably, they were the general contractor behind Stanley Marketplace, behind The Source in Rhino. They're working on Argo Mill with Dana Crawford. They are working on, they did Broadway Market, and they, ironically, they also did the Trailhead years ago for Crown Hill Memorial Park. They are the best in terms of historic adaptive reuse, complex projects such as this, where we don't have as-built drawings, we don't have the typical drawings you would find on a newer built project. This is really their specialty. And then BuildMark is an owner rep, so they will be advising both myself and Quana as the project moves forward on a construction management standpoint.
Thank you. Any additional questions? Ms. Hoppy?
I'm going to ask for consensus to loan renewal Wheat Ridge $500,000 with a repayment schedule of up to 5 years, beginning repayment in 2021 for the purpose of redevelopment to the Gold Grocery area.
Do we have consensus? Okay, we have consensus to move forward. Thank you, gentlemen, for bringing this presentation to us. Look forward to seeing that at council. Do you know when that might come to council?
January 13th, probably, we could get it done.
Okay, we're going to have a big meeting on the 13th. All right, thank you so much. Our next item of business is agenda item number 2. This is the Wadsworth widening right-of-way acquisition update. Mr. Westberg.
So this is going to be a little bit of a repeat from what we did back earlier this year, but since half of our council is new, and at least one of them asked to learn more about the city side of eminent domain, we thought we'd bring this up, but we also have interspersed in this an update on what we're doing and where we are on Wadsworth. So just the sort of what's already happened is back on January 14th, so almost a year ago, City Council authorized staff and the consultant to negotiate and purchase right-of-way for the Wadsworth widening project. At that time, we were not authorized to use eminent domain. And the mayor and the city clerk were authorized to accept the acquired right-of-way, so we don't have to bring all those right-of-way documents back to you to accept. You guys, the council authorized the mayor and the city clerk to accept that right-of-way. We have 2 full acquisitions that we're working on, and we started that project, started working on those really back in June, and sent offers to them in September, and then final offers were sent at the end of October. We'll explain what some of this language is as we go along. And for those of you that heard this the first time, maybe there'll be a pop quiz or something. Partial acquisitions, we have 66 of those to do. We have a lot of properties along this 1.25 miles of Wadsworth. The notice of intents were sent in early December, and so all those 66 property owners have been notified that we need to acquire right-of-way from them, and there was a little packet of stuff that went with all of that. So what we're going to talk about is the right-of-way acquisition process. We're going to talk about what notice of intents are, what it means to determine just compensation, what goes in the initial offer packets, what those initial offers and initial negotiations are, what incentives are, and then what we do with counter offers from the property owners. And then finally, the last 2 things are final offers and last and final offers. And then we're going to have a little Q&A session just on sort of that typical right-of-way process. And then at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about eminent domain 101, really what is eminent domain. A lot of people think it's this, and it's not that. It's not this government coming along and taking out your property at whim. So we're going to talk about what it is and what it isn't. And Greg Jamison, who's our right-of-way consultant, we'll introduce him a little bit in a minute. And he's going to talk about what those things are, when it's used and how it's used, who pays for what, and what council action is necessary, and what happens if council doesn't authorize us to use it, if we end up needing to use it at some point. And like I said, Greg Jamison is our right-of-way consultant. He's sitting over here. He's got a lot of history. He worked for CDOT, worked for the Attorney General's office, and now is working for HDR, our consulting firm, to do our right-of-way acquisition. So he's been doing this kind of work for a really long time and has lots of great stories should you wish to hear all of those. I just have a few stories. So the notice of intent was sent early in December on the partial acquisitions, and what it really does, it informs the owner that the city intends to purchase right-of-way from them. If the estimated value of the purchase that we're estimating when the notice of intent is sent out is more than $5,000, we also let the owner know that according to state law, you're allowed to go get an appraisal, and if it meets certain standards, it has to be received within 90 days of the notice of intent, so in this case, that'll be early March, and it has to meet minimum qualifications for what is commonly called an eminent domain appraisal. They just call them that. Doesn't mean they're all used for that. then the city will reimburse the cost of the appraisal. So on the 2 full acquisitions that we're well along with, we actually did reimburse those 2 owners. Those 2 owners both sought their own appraisals, and they met the minimum qualifications and got them to us within 90 days. So we reimbursed them for those. And then the other thing that we offer them is that HDR can stake the right-of-way limits on their property, so they can go out and see exactly where this new line is going to be. So they're not having to guess, because not everybody knows where their property lines are. So then the next thing we do, as soon as the notice of intent goes out, we start determining that just compensation. That process takes about 11 weeks, plus or minus a week or 2. We figure out what the value of the property is that we're actually acquiring. If they've got improvements on that property, they have curb and gutter or parking or signs or different things, we figure out what the value of those improvements are. And then if there's any damages to the property, if we impact the owner so much that it constitutes a damage to the remainder, then we pay them for those damages also. If the estimated value of the purchase is greater than $25,000, then we use a licensed appraiser to get that appraisal, to determine that just compensation. If it's less than 25 grand, then we have experienced right-of-way professionals at HDR that determine that value. It's called a waiver valuation is what it's called, because it's a waiver from having to get the full appraisal. Because federal funds are involved in Wadsworth, a second certified appraiser reviews all of the city's appraisers, and if the owner gets an appraisal, they review those also. And they're the ones that determine whether that appraiser meets those minimum requirements to be reimbursed. And they also look at that, and then they determine what they think the fair market value is. They may agree with what the appraiser's done. They may say the appraiser's high or the appraiser's low. On projects that involve CDOT, they've got CDOT staff that are appraisers, that are certified appraisers. And so on those projects, they typically do those appraisers themselves. Now, if we happen to hit them at a very, very busy time, they might hire that out to somebody else. I apparently hit a plus button instead of the forward button. So the initial offer packet, which is done after the fair market value has been determined, so in this case, we're hoping to have those all ready to go by early April, would have the amount of the offer, the exhibits showing the right-of-way parcels to be acquired, so basically a map showing what's happening on their property, and then a memorandum of agreement, and that's basically our contract to purchase the property, the right-of-way. So that has a discussion of the impacts, the conditions of the purchase, and what the fair market value is. And then I realized I just messed this up. The Uniform Act brochure actually goes out with the notice of intent. So I put this in the wrong spot. So in addition to the other stuff that came in that notice of intent, they got a brochure that is somewhat legalese that explains what the Uniform Act is and how that it relates to what their rights are as a property owner and what the process is going to be. The initial negotiations, we typically take 8 weeks on those, so that would start in early April and end at the end of May. And during that time period, the real estate specialists at HDR are going to meet and talk with the property owners, if they want to talk about explain the offer, explain what's in the MOA, explain the drawings if they need to. They answer questions. If they ask for additional information, we'll provide that to them. And really just to discuss any concerns they may have. They may say, no, there's something going on you don't know about, and then we'll factor that into what we're doing. Our goal of this 8-week period is that we want to have good faith negotiations resulting in a consensual agreement. We'd love it if we all came to an agreement on what the fair market value is and how it needs to proceed and all those kind of things. On the projects that I've done since starting at the city and working on these federal aid jobs, we've managed to get to consensual agreement eventually on every single one. We've not had to take anybody to eminent domain. We got on the courthouse steps once, but that was as close as we've gotten to having to actually do eminent domain. So one of the things we're using on the Wadsworth project is called incentives. They have to accept the initial offer within 30 days, which in this case would be early May, and the incentive is scaled based on the amount of FMV. And basically, it's just some additional money that is given to try to incentivize, to prod the property owner, encourage the property owner to accept the offer that we've given them. This has been used by CDOT a lot lately, and it's been really effective in getting those negotiations to happen in that initial negotiation period and to try to avoid having to go into eminent domain and stuff. And so that's really our goal with this is to make things happen as quickly as possible. We've used incentives on a lot of our right-of-way acquisitions for the Ward TOD projects that we've done, and they've been really successful in getting things happening within that 30-day period. So if the property owner has a valid argument for additional compensation, then we're gonna accept that, and we're gonna look at it, and we're gonna evaluate it, and we'll change our offer if we need to. If they just say, I think my property's worth $20,000 more, that's an opinion, not a valid argument. But if they say, you're really impacting because of this, this, and this, I need more money to mitigate that, then we'll certainly look at that. Once that 8-week period is over, we do what's called a final offer. And this is going to last for 2 weeks. They don't last very long. We basically tell them we're going to continue for 2 more weeks, and that the city may come to council and ask for authorization to use eminent domain. And so we're trying to just let them know that we really need to get this done, and we've got a project we've got to get under construction. We want to get this project finished. When that period's over, we generally send out what's called a last and final offer, which is sort of our last-ditch effort, if you will, to try to finish this off. We're going to continue for 2 more weeks typically, and then we will use, in this case, I will come to council and ask for authorization to use eminent domain, since I've not been given that authorization yet, and to try to get the project done. We've got to get this finished off. So the goal is just to basically inform the owner we've got potential legal action coming. Because the eminent domain process does involve attorneys and things like that, and so it is a legal process. So are there any questions in general about the right-of-way acquisition stuff we just covered?
And Mark, Mr. Mayor, before we go there, one of the primary reasons we're bringing this to you tonight, besides the fact that there's 4 new council members, but also to talk about the scheduling and the thresholds that the city has to meet because of the federal funding that we're getting. So back up a little bit and talk about that, because that's the important reason we're here.
That's the big reason we're here this time period. The 2 full acquisitions, and we can go ahead and just cover those slides really quickly. We've got 2 full acquisitions. One at Midas, which is also called 5G Holdings, is our sidewalk ends up really close to their front doors, and we take out virtually all their parking that's in front of the building. And so our thought on that was, this looks like it's going to be a full acquisition. We're damaging them beyond the point that they don't have an economic remainder. And so we went down this path of doing a full acquisition on Midas. We came to an agreement with them really, really quickly on the just compensation for the property and the damages and everything. Well, they don't have damages because we're just buying them outright. What our initial offer plus incentive was almost exactly what their appraisal was. And so we got to an agreement really quickly, but they wanted some additional compensation that really isn't allowed under the Uniform Act. So we're not really allowed to give them that. So they, very early on in the process, said, hey, why don't we just take this thing to eminent domain and let the judge decide, and we'll just move on. We said, no, we've got a process we want to go through, and so we wanted to do that. The owners have recently hired a local attorney to represent them. They're mostly out-of-state owners. But they're also now investigating staying in their current location. So we've kind of put the brakes on things a little bit with them. We normally allow 2 weeks for that final offer. We've allowed over a month because we're trying to give them a chance to talk to that neighboring property owner to see if they can't try to stay in that location. The second one that we've got the issue with is Raleigh Bertos, which is also a full acquisition. We're going to move the signal from 3 Acre Lane up to 41st Avenue, and basically the east leg of that intersection, the new driveway into big lots and the post office and stuff, ends up hitting their building and taking out their drive-through. And if you know anything about Raleigh Bertos, their drive-through is extremely important to them. And so the potential for eminent domain there is that the owner's appraisal that they got was 40% higher than ours. It was a lot higher than ours. And so we've been working with them. We've talked about the reason the appraisals have different methodologies. We think theirs is wrong based on what we typically do, and they think ours is wrong based on what they want to do. And so we just really haven't gotten very close. They've recently also hired a local attorney, and they made a counteroffer, but it's still 25% higher than our final offer was, which was a little higher than the initial offer. And so we just sort of reached an impasse with both of these properties on sort of where we're landing right now. And so what we're planning on doing is we were looking at possibly submitting last and final offers this week to both properties because we just sort of reached an impasse. With Midas, we are allowing them a little more time to try to investigate going to the, staying in their current location. And then with Raleigh Bertos, we're going to continue to try to negotiate with the owner's attorney, but she's made it pretty clear that they feel really strongly about their appraisal and how good it is, and that ours is just wrong. And so we do think on those 2 properties we may need to come. Now, what we've got in the schedule right now is to come to council on January 13th to ask for permission to pursue eminent domain on these 2 properties. And our reason for that is we've got a couple of deadlines. Our big pot of money, which is $25 million worth of federal funds, we actually have one strike against us, as I outlined in the council memo. We have one strike against us already. We didn't start right away last October, which was our original schedule, because of some of the delays in the environmental process. Our next deadline is to start construction in October. Well, with these full acquisitions, we've got relocation to do. They've got to find a new place to go. We've got to get them moved out. We've got to get things happening. And so we want to keep this moving forward. Now, the full acquisitions are not on the critical path, but we do want to keep these moving forward. The partial acquisitions are the critical path for this project. And so once we start sending out initial offers, we're going to hold really tightly to that 8-week time frame for initial negotiations. We're going to hold very tightly to the 2-week time frame for the finals, and then the 2-week time frame for the last and finals. And then if we've got some outstanding parcels by then that we haven't acquired, we're going to come back to council in June, the end of June, and ask for authority to go with eminent domain. Because at that point, if we're at June, we're about 3 months away from losing our federal funding, potentially losing it. We can always go to Dr. Cog and ask to keep it, but I've done that once on Kipling. We actually lost our funding on our Kipling project, had to go beg to get it back, and we got it back, but it's just not a process I relish going through again. It's also our first deadline for our second pot of federal funds, which is $5 million, that we just got awarded this last year. So we do have some pretty critical deadlines. Like I said, this one's not as critical. We may float this schedule a little bit depending on what Midas tells us. He says, oh, I'm really close to a deal with the guys next door. If he comes back next week and says, you know what, the guys next door said no, we got to work on a deal, then we may be coming back on January 3rd. Big meeting on January 13th. To possibly ask council for authorization to eminent domain if one or both of these properties, if we haven't come to a deal by then. So that's our reason for coming to you tonight to talk about this, with also having four new council people. We just wanted to get this in front of you and let you know before we come to you to actually ask for permission to do that. So if you'd like, we can answer questions now about just the general right-of-way process, and then we can talk about what eminent domain is and isn't, or we can just charge right into that part of the deal if you want to.
Do we have any questions right now generated, or should we have Mr. Westberg continue on with his presentation? Ms. Dozman?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can you elaborate a little bit as to why we could not help Midas either relocate or compensate for them to be somewhere else in Wheat Ridge?
Yeah, and I think I'll let Greg answer those questions because he's been in the weeds a little bit more on that.
So this federal law is an acquisition and relocation act, and we work with the displaced businesses, in this case Midas and Relibertos, to help them find a replacement property to move into and then secure that and then move from one place to the other. And the Midas situation, the owner and the franchisee are the same person, and he's been very proactive looking at all kinds of different possibilities. We've found several possibilities and provided those to them as options, and then we've sat down with him and his attorney, and he's looking at a couple of different possibilities, and what the monetary relocation benefits are important to him in analyzing those, and we've helped try to break that down. The last time we met, they came up with this idea of, hey, let's see if we can reconfigure the site and work out something with the adjacent landowner so we can stay. Asked Mark, and Mark was very willing to allow that to happen. So relocation is very hand in glove work. You know, there's monetary benefits, but there's also kind of living with the displaced occupants to try to find replacement properties, because they need to find them, get them secured, and then move from one place to the other. And we're doing the best we can on that one. And there's a couple of interesting possibilities that we're hoping something is going to break soon there.
Thank you. Mr. Stites.
Along those same lines, will the other businesses that are or the properties that have just the partial acquisition, will they kind of be given the same treatment? They'll have opportunities to relocate or?
Well, the relocation benefits are only applicable for the total acquisitions. In this case right now, it's Midas and Relibertos, because we're purchasing the whole property, displacing the business, and the relocation program is active on those. That's why we started on those early, because that's a long lead item that we need to take some time to work on. The partial acquisitions, we're under the impression that the damage, the impact on the property is not so severe and they will be allowed to stay. Some of these there's a couple of them that are close, but we've had several discussions with the landowners in the planning process, and they're very interested in staying. And a lot of how that works out is going to be a function of what the numbers are on the appraisals. But, you know, we're working with them. Both of those landowners are represented by attorneys, and Mark and I have sat down and had conversations with them. So, but after that, everything else is pretty much a no-brainer partial acquisition, and then we're just talking about just compensation for the part taken and then looking at damages to the remainder.
Thank you. Ms. Westberg, if you want to go ahead with your presentation.
So we'll talk about what eminent domain is. It's also known as condemnation. I really hate using that word because there's like not a more negative word in the English dictionary. And we're not really ever condemning anything. We're doing it. And so again, a lot of people think it's big government coming along with a giant mallet and squashing some poor little guy that's in his house or his business. And it's just not that. It's really a judicial process. It's a process by which you determine what the fair compensation is. It's part of the Fifth Amendment. I learned a lot of stuff from Greg. It's part of the Fifth Amendment down here. One of the 5 things that come out of the Fifth Amendment that says property owners must be compensated for anything that the government needs from them when they buy property and stuff. And it really is just a neutral third party. It's not the city, it's not the property owner that decides what that just compensation is if we've reached a point where we've reached an impasse. And again, it's not the government coming along and stealing stuff. It's not a taking of property. We're not allowed to do that. Both the federal and the state laws prohibit the city from taking property from people. We have to compensate them for that. So if we really think about, well, then what is this eminent domain thing? It is that just compensation thing. We decide to take property as soon as we decide to widen Wadsworth. I mean, that really is when the city did the sub-area plan in 2009 with the 150-foot right-of-way. That's when we as a city decided we have to buy property along Wadsworth because we don't have 150 feet of right-of-way. Now, as we've gone through the environmental and design process, we've gotten that right-of-way down to about 130 feet in a lot of places, and I think the widest that we ever buy is about 140 feet. So we've really worked really hard to minimize what we're having to buy from those businesses. But again, it doesn't decide if the property gets acquired, it just decides that just compensation. So I was going to let Greg cover these because, again, he's got some great stories if you guys want to hear them about when and how it's used.
Thanks, Mark. I don't know that I'll be as entertaining as he thinks I will be, but just a little bit about myself. So I've been in right-of-way acquisition for 25 years. 5 years was as an assistant attorney general representing CDOT in eminent domain. 15 years as a right-of-way manager for CDOT for the entire metro area, buying right-of-way for all kinds of transportation projects and trying to avoid eminent domain, but managing it when we had to do it. And then in the last 5 years, working with HDR, representing municipality CDOTs in real estate acquisition. Again, trying to avoid it at all costs, but there are situations where eminent domain is necessary, unfortunately. Here's a couple of examples of when eminent domain is used. These are the most common examples. The first one is this uncooperative owner or just situations where you cannot bridge the gap. You have an appraisal at one number for the city and another number at the landowner, and you try to negotiate towards the middle and you just can't get there. This is kind of where we are on Raul Albertos. We'll see, hopefully we can bridge that gap and find something in the middle. But in situations like this, we do the final offer, the last and final offer, and if eminent domain is authorized, move the matter into eminent domain. Some things that I've found over the years is once you introduce attorneys into the equation, it changes the dynamic. When I was an attorney general doing eminent domain, a lot of times we'd get the file. The first thing we'd do is call the opposing attorney, and sometimes we would get those worked out before we even had to file the eminent domain action. But, it's very common when you file the action, you kind of on this litigation track, but you're also parallel on a negotiation track to try to get it settled. When I was at CDOT, We used eminent domain 20% of the time, but of the 20%, less than 1% went all the way to evaluation trial. We'll talk about this a little bit. There's two stages in eminent domain. One is an immediate possession hearing, another is evaluation trial. Very few of these cases go all the way to evaluation trial. It's very common for them to settle along the way, but sometimes introducing the attorneys and getting it into their hands changes the dynamic and creates a situation where the negotiation is more constructive. Let's see. Another one is unresponsive owners. Sometimes we buy from large multinational corporations, and it's very difficult to find the right person in the organization that's authorized to do the real estate transaction. You know, acquisitions for transportation projects are way outside the norm of what large corporations do, so they really don't have a person to handle that. And a lot of times navigating the bureaucracy to find the right person and get that person to do it is difficult, and if you can't figure that out, then if you file eminent domain, you can bring an attorney in on their side to help navigate to find the right person and get to a constructive deal. On a recent project, we had a partial acquisition from Starbucks, and it took us a while to find the right person in the organization, and we actually got to an agreement pretty quickly on the number, and then we followed up, and there was nothing. Turns out that person had left. Nobody told us. We took a while to figure out who had taken over. By the time we found the new person, they had to start all over again in the process, and we were just running out of time, so we went ahead and turned that one into eminent domain. And then they got an attorney involved, and they said, okay, now we can navigate the organization and get to a deal. So sometimes just, the size and the bureaucracy of who you're buying from, that's how you need to use it to solve the situation. Another case, and we seem to see this on a lot of projects, usually only one or two landowners on a lot of projects, but we cannot find the owner. It'll be a person who is deceased, and we can't find the representative of the decedent estate, or else it'll be a corporation or some kind of artificial entity that's defunct. And we do have a lot of resources to try and track these landowners down, but it is amazing. There's always one or two where you just can't find them, and in those situations you file eminent domain. You get authority from the court to serve through publication, and then you get valid service of process, and you can get your order of possession so that you can go ahead and build the project. Those are rare, but there's more of those than I'd like to say. And then this one is a little bit more rare, and this is where you'll work with the landowner, you'll get a consensual agreement, but if there is a tenant or a lien holder, they have to sign off on the agreement that you've got with your landowner. We always start our negotiations with the landowner, and we've had some instances where a tenant or a lien holder will not sign off on that, and they'll say, hey, we think the just compensation should be more, or they'll get in a dispute as to how much each gets of that money, and they can't get it solved. And in situations like that, it's almost like an interpleader. We file the action. We say, hey, here's the amount of just compensation, and try to get the court order allowing that to be the amount for the acquisition, and then they can solve their dispute as to who gets what with a allocation hearing afterwards. Had one of these on a recent project where we got to a deal with the landowner, but the lien holder absolutely refused, said it was not enough money. That one went all the way to an immediate possession hearing and then passed that before it actually settled. So those are the situations that eminent domain is used. Procedurally, how does eminent domain work? The first thing is that our real estate specialists turn over a file to the city's attorney. Again, the city attorney, the first thing they're going to do is call the other side and see if they can work this out. If they can't, they'll file a petition, an eminent domain petition. The owner, all the interested parties are served. A notice is filed in the county records. The first step in the process is an immediate possession hearing. Sometimes, once you file, you can get an agreement on possession right away. And possession is you want to get possession so you can go ahead and build the project and then continue to negotiate the just compensation amount. But if you can't get that, the immediate possession hearing is set. It's an expedited hearing. The city needs to prove a couple of things. It's the need for the right-of-way, that it has satisfied good faith negotiations, the amount of the just compensation. If the city proves those, the court will give the city immediate possession. That's an order that says the city has possession of the property. Let me see, get to this next slide. City has possession of the property as soon as it pays the estimate of just compensation into the registry of the court. Once it's there, the landowners can withdraw it and use it. So the city gets possession of the property to build the project, and then the parties can continue to negotiate for that just compensation matter. And if they can't figure that out, then it's set for the valuation trial. The next step is evaluation trial. Again, it's very rare that these cases go all the way to evaluation trial. What you want to have at an eminent domain valuation trial is you want to have a disinterested third party. If the parties can't agree on what the city's going to pay the parties, you're going to have a disinterested third party tell the city what it's going to pay for the property. It is a trial to either a jury or a three-person commission. The three-person commission is appointed by the judge. That's the choice of the landowner. And the trial is pretty much the landowner's attorney, or the city's attorney gets up and says the property's worth X. The landowner's attorney says the property's worth Y. The disinterested third party says, here's what the just compensation is. The city pays that into the court, and the court conveys the property to the city. If the city has paid money for the possession and the amount at the valuation trial is more, then the city has to pay that additional compensation to get the property. So, and you know, eminent judicial actions are difficult and emotional for sure, and I'm not trying to say that these aren't, but I did practice law a number of years before I got into the eminent domain setting, and it was not quite as emotional as some of these other litigations, just in that the governmental entities do have a respect for what the landowners are doing and want to treat them with dignity and respect and try to get these things solved consensually. If you go all the way to a valuation trial, the city's going to have to pay for the right-of-way consultant and the city's attorneys that's litigating the action. The city has to pay for preparation of exhibits, all the court costs. These are usually tried outside of the case, since you have to pay for a court reporter. And the landowner has to pay for their own attorney's fees, but if the final amount of the valuation trial, if the award is 30% greater than the city's last and final offer, then the city has to pay for the landowner's attorney's fees. It's very expensive for the city to take these matters all the way to a valuation trial. The city's very cognizant of that. I'll turn it back over to Mark.
So, if the last and final offer is not accepted and eminent domain has not been authorized, then we've got to come back to council for some kind of action, and that can take 2 to 4 weeks depending on how we do it. If we just come back at a regular meeting and ask for authority for eminent domain, then that'll take about 2 weeks from the time we sort of decide to do that and the time we get in front of council. If we go the other route, which is to sort of do what we're doing tonight, which is to brief you on where we are with things in a study session and then come back at a regular meeting, that could take up to 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks, depending on how things go there. The big thing is that we'd have to come back to you during a public meeting, because it is a resolution to authorize eminent domain, to start the eminent domain process on specific properties that are outstanding acquisitions, like we would be doing on January 13th. If council then authorizes that, the city attorney would proceed with that. If eminent domain was previously authorized, for instance, if we come to you on the 13th and say, hey, can we file eminent domain, can we have authorization to do it on these two properties, and you give us that, then it takes a couple of weeks. We'd come back to you in study session, let you know where we are with things, and then we could just let you know where we are sort of on the overall acquisitions, let you know which ones we might be starting an eminent domain process, and we could either just council could say, great, let's keep going, or we could actually do a more formal and ask for a consensus to proceed with those, or however council wants to do that. The big thing about doing this, sort of, if you gave us, and you've not, but if you gave us more of a blanket authorization, is that it makes it less personal. If you just authorize us to go use eminent domain on this project, then I don't have to come back to council on individual properties, and so it makes it a little less personal. Now, council has not done that yet, and so we're going to go down the more personal route where I come back and ask for things on individual properties. So if council decides not to authorize eminent domain at some point, you just don't want to do it, we don't want to do it, we can just simply overpay these sort of uncooperative landowners, which I don't really like, mostly because of the middle one. I think it's not a good use of taxpayer funds. We're about $225,000 apart with Raleigh Bertos right now. And so it's all city dollars because it's a full acquisition, and I just don't want to spend that extra $200,000 when my appraisal says it's really worth this, and we don't think that the way they've done their appraisal is correct. So it unnecessarily increases right-of-way costs, and if we do have a bunch of folks that we sort of settle with amenably, then it seems unfair that just because these guys are being uncooperative, we're having to pay them a lot more. The other thing we can do is we can redesign the project around the outstanding properties, but that probably is going to impact somebody else. We had to redesign Wadsworth around the Lutheran church up at the north end, and so the folks on the west side are losing, instead of like maybe 20 feet of right-of-way, they're losing more like 40 feet of their property. And we just, I don't think it's fair that we did it there either, but that was a historical thing, so that was a process we had to follow. And again, the cooperative owners say, well, why are you impacting me more? Because this other guys didn't want to play ball with you. The other real issue is that the delays it would cause. If it's a big enough deal, then we have to go back through the environmental process again. And quite frankly, at that point, we probably would just lose our federal funding. So we could really jeopardize our federal funding on that. And then we've just got to pay the consultants to do a whole bunch of extra work. If we decided to just, well, you know what, we've got 5 guys that we just can't come to an agreement on, let's just abandon the project, then we end up with this. I really like this graphic. I got this off the internet. There's a lot of great stuff out there. It really, in that regard, we failed to address the public need and purpose of the project, and everything we spent almost $4 million so far on just this Wadsworth project getting to where we are today. We've got another, $41 million to spend, but at whatever point we sort of pull the plug on the project, we've wasted all that effort we've done early on. So we're just ready. Again, that's not what eminent domain is. I love my graphic. So again, we're just here to answer questions. For the 2 properties that we're sort of briefing you on tonight, the Raleigh Bertos and Midas, we're going to keep working with those guys to try to get there, but we're just so far apart with Raleigh Bertos that on the 13th or at some council meeting after that, we may come back to you and ask for the authority to use eminent domain to move that one forward, and let a neutral third party decide what they think the just compensation is. And same thing with Midas, if we just don't get to an agreement on the little bit of extra stuff they want that we're just not allowed to give them under the Uniform Act. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. Westberg. Okay, we'll open this up for questions of council. Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. With respect to Roberto's, as it relates to the appraisal that they received compared to the appraisal that we have, were both appraisers licensed appraisers, or were there was another person you mentioned that wasn't a licensed appraiser that was involved in some cases?
So they were both licensed appraisers. The CDOT review of those appraisers said they were both met the minimum requirements for being considered an eminent domain appraisal, so that's why we reimbursed them for the appraisal that they had. They used a different method. I'll let Greg talk about the 2 methods because I understand some of it, not all of it.
Sure. Thank you.
So first of all, the federal aid process requires in situations like this where you have 2 appraisals, it's given to CDOT, and a review appraiser looks at it with a second set of disinterested eyes to make sure it accurately reflects fair market value.
And that person's also a licensed appraiser?
Yes,
as well?
yeah, everybody is a certified general license appraisal. There's 4 tiers of appraisal licensing. That's the top tier. And then they are also on CDOT's approved list. and it's an approved list. They are called eminent domain appraisers. Mark referred to that term. Really, eminent domain appraisers is just appraisal of people that can do this boutique specialty of appraisal of a partial acquisition property. So in this instance, both of these appraisals were submitted to the CDOT review appraiser for review. The CDOT review appraiser looked at them both and determined that the city's appraisal at the lower amount was the correct one, and that's the amount to be offered. And I don't want to get into too much about the differences, but it's an income generating property, and the way that the appraisers use the income approach and the comparable market sales that they, or market rental that they used, led to different results.
And does that have anything to do with the context of the project being involved, or was there any sort of project rule involved relative to the income as it relates to whether the project was being done or not?
No, in this niche specialty, there's a thing called project influence, and if you have a number of properties in a project, and the project's been in a planning stage for several years like this, what project influence means is you can't use comparable sales in the same area, because the market value may be diminished based on the specter of the project. It could be diminished 10 or 20%. So to avoid project influence, you're supposed to find sales outside of the project area so that it accurately reflects just compensation and fair market value. Both appraisers used rental and sales comps outside of the immediate project area, so they were in compliance with that. That's not the driving force on the difference in this instance.
It was the income calculation then?
It was the way that they used the income calculation.
Okay.
The income approach.
Thank you.
So I don't know how much we need to get into that in kind of a public setting. We could probably discuss it a little bit more, maybe in an executive setting. So.
Thank you.
Ms. Hutchinson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have a question. Why do we need so much of the land of Midas? When I look south, the Corners is built right on the road, all the way down there on Wadsworth. So is that because of the CFIs?
So the Corners was built as a build-to project, so they've got like no setback. The sidewalk you see in front of the Corners, they basically put that sidewalk where the project needed that sidewalk to be in front of their property. We talked with them, and they chose to build the sort of the future sidewalk for us, so it doesn't have to get torn out in the future. So if you stand on that sidewalk and look south, that gives you a rough idea of where that sidewalk's going to project. So the road itself doesn't widen all the way to Midas, but the sidewalk that we've got there ends up about 10 feet in front of their front door. And so in our estimation, before we contacted them, we thought, we think this is a full acquisition because they can't use their muffler shop anymore. Well, and they sort of, when we first approached them, they said, yep, you're right, we can't use our muffler shop. We got no parking, we can't get in out of the front door. We typically pull the cars through, and as this has progressed, I think they've gone back and done some really hard thinking. This relocating is really hard, and it's not going to be, ideal maybe for us. So let's really sit back and think creatively and look at trying to stay where we are, and that's what they're doing right now. To do that, they would need to, pull all the cars in off of 38th and pull in the back, and then back them back out and pull them out, and they'll have like maybe 5 parking spaces on their site. And so they're working on a deal to try to either get an access to the neighbors so they can drive through that, or to be able to park extra cars, like employees' cars or something like that, on that neighbor's lot somewhere. And so that's what they're trying to work through. And we don't know how that's going. We haven't heard anything from anybody about that. So I would love for that to happen, because then we don't have to buy Midas. We can just buy the property we need out in front for the right-of-way.
So what about on the other side, on the east side, like Burger King?
Right.
That doesn't, that's really close to the road where the drive-through is.
Sure. So on the east side, the frame of reference there is the existing sidewalk that's in front of the Safeway Shopping Center. The back of that sidewalk is the line that we held for the back of our new sidewalk. So everything happening in front of Safeway and Burger King and Boston Market pretty much starts at the back of the sidewalk and moves forward. There's a little bit more at the corner where Burger King is, but we're not impacting Burger King's drive-through. And there will actually be a little bit of grass between the new CFI lane and the Burger King drive-through.
I just have...
Sure, no, you're fine.
So whose idea was it for the CFI, Wheatridge or CDOT?
That was an idea that was born out of the process that we went through, the year-long process that we went through in trying to figure this whole thing out. And so that was determined to be the one that had the least right-of-way impact, the most capacity, and a few other things. That's why that one rose to the top. We looked at a lot of different options, and that was the one that rose to the top as being the one that met all the purpose and need the best of all the things we had. If you think about the intersection, let's just think about 30th Avenue today. Okay, we've got double lefts on 30th Avenue already. We have a single left on Wadsworth, and then we have 2 through lanes in each direction. If we widen it out to 3 through lanes, that's great. We get a few more cars through the intersection. But it's that left turning, and even if we put double lefts in, we still are going to struggle to get everybody through that intersection. Because of the amount of left turning traffic we have on 38th and on 44th, that's what really hurts us with just the double left turn design in Wadsworth, which is where the plan originally was going. And as we analyze that, when we look at the 2040 projections, it fails before we get to 2040. And the FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration, won't fund a project that fails before that 20-year design life. They say, if we think it's going to fail before 20 years, we're not going to fund it. And so we had to go back and look at other options. And the CFI was one that rose to the top as being the best option.
Thank you, Mr. Stites.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick question, just because so many of us are new on the council. As far as that design goes, will any of that design come back to council at all, or is that basically set?
So the environmental assessment was finished earlier this year, and the FONSI, the Finding of No Significant Impact, the final environmental document was signed in, I believe it was September 13th on a Friday, which is interesting to me. That was signed, so that's the environmental document that we have to move forward with. If we change anything, if we want to go back and revisit the intersection type or anything else, we restart the entire clock over again. And that's the part where we very likely lose our federal funding. So the CFI is the design we're moving forward with right now, and if some of the new folks on council want me to come and give a presentation about CFIs, I'd certainly be willing to do that just to get you up to speed on what they are and how they work and stuff.
Well, I mean, I appreciate that, and I've seen it, and I've sat through this presentation before too, and I've actually found the presentation on eminent domain very informative, because it certainly changed, the first one changed my perception of it. I guess my question is, with the design, and one of the topics that kind of came up was, do we need that much space with a different design? Do we need to take that much square footage? So like last week we had a constituent come in with tape measures and show us how much we're actually taking. Is there a way to take less property? Is there a design that works for that and still gives us everything that we need?
Yeah, so we did look at that. In April of last year, we went through a value engineering process where we had an independent group of folks. There were some CDOT folks that were the guy that was in charge of the construction project south of here. There was the gal that came in and moderated it was from Canada. Actually, she's an expert on doing value engineering. They actually have a certification. And then we had our construction guy was on it, our field supervisor, and then we had a couple of other folks from a couple of different consultants that we had come in. And they really sat down as a fresh set of eyes and looked at the project and looked at what we could do. And we did reduce things quite a bit. We reduced our amenity zone areas from 10 feet to 8 feet. We reduced some of our sidewalks from 10 feet to 8 feet because we determined that wasn't necessary. You know, originally we had a cycle track on the east side for a ways, and they said, you know what, we just don't need it for that short of a distance. Let's just make a wider multi-use path that accommodates both bikes and peds. And so we did that. So there was a lot of stuff done, and we estimate that value engineering saved us $5 million. And a lot of that cost was in right-of-way costs, because we shaved off like 4 feet the entire length of Wadsworth. And in a mile and a quarter, that becomes a really significant amount. If we were to make changes now at this late in the game, then we run the risk of having to sort of backtrack and do things over. Our consulting team, the design team, is working on their next submittal, which is the 90% plan set that is going to be done at the end of December. Our plan with that is to have another public meeting at the end of January to sort of roll that plan set out and say, hey, everybody, we saw you last summer. We thought we'd give you another update on where we are with everything and where things are. Now, all the property owners are going to be getting really detailed updates because we're actually going out and staking the property on people's grounds. But the design we have has been looked at pretty hard by a lot of people to try to really, minimize the impact we're having on the people on the sides. When we first started this with the 150-foot right-of-way, we had much bigger impacts. And with what we've done now, we've really reduced those impacts down to what we think is the bare minimum.
Okay. as I was campaigning and talking to people and business owners specifically, there's a lot of concern in the business community coming down Wadsworth there that we're going to cut off a lot of their access to their property and all of that. And I guess I'm asking this, is the design the best business-friendly design for Wadsworth as well, as far as the CFI lanes that are going to spit people quickly to the left and right, but are they still going to be able to drive down Wadsworth and stop at those stores and those restaurants and things like that?
Sure. So, a couple of things on that. With going to the 3 lanes in both directions, which are absolutely necessary to carry the capacity we have today, much less in 20 years, we've got to put medians in the middle. When you go to 3 lanes, the standard practice is just to put medians. And so those medians are what's taking away that left turning opportunity for a lot of businesses. One of the benefits that we get with the CFIs is that at 4 locations where those CFI crossover signals are ahead of the main signal, is we get a chance for those businesses to have a signalized left turn in. So for instance, if we're going north at the corners where they've got their main entrance on Wadsworth, when we're done with our project, they get a signal that allows a left turn in with a green arrow. So a protected left turn in. Same thing at Safeway. Safeway right now, I go to Safeway all the time. I used to live north and now I live south of it. But it's really hard sometimes to turn left across that traffic to get into Safeway if you're coming from the north. Well, with the CFI design, we actually get a signal at the Safeway entrance that will allow people not just to get in the CFI lane, but to turn left in. The other location is going to be right up across from Amici's, which is the little coffee hut and the Daco and Sons Fleet Maintenance. There'll be a signalized left turn onto Mr. Lesher's corner there, the property that he's a part of. So we think there are changes in access, but we think gaining that left turn in is a huge benefit. And then at 45th Avenue, or Place, I can never keep those straight, the first one going north, just north of O'Reilly's, there'll be another left turn signalized in for that location. And so the guys at Pep Boys will actually have a left turn that people could turn left, a little bit ahead of time and get in there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Dozeman?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I have several questions and several thoughts on this issue specifically. One of my biggest concerns is that even after I had been newly elected and we were discussing the preferred design concepts of Wadsworth, and I really appreciate Mr. Stites and Ms. Hutchinson's thoughts on this matter, because it has always been portrayed to us as kind of like a Chicken Little situation. The sky is falling and this is the CFIs are the preferred design, and if we don't follow through with this and we're no longer going to have the funding, and it seems to me that we are acquiring more right-of-way due to the CFI design than we would have with a double left turn lane that CDOT had used as the preferred design in Lakewood, who has 3 times the population that Wheat Ridge does. So that's one concern of mine, and maybe you want to address that specifically. And I do want to give a huge shout out to Mr. Loescher. The visual example that he gave with the tape measures was a nice touch. I actually did go home, and my dad and I measured 25 feet of my property, and it would have come about 1.5 feet away from my front door. And to see firsthand how much property would have been taken if it had been my property was quite eye-opening. And so when we're discussing this all along Wadsworth, it does become an issue as far as those businesses. And it's not that I don't want Wadsworth to be widened. I definitely think that this is a project that is much needed in our community. It has been supported by 2E. Our constituents definitely want that to be a quicker corridor. And having driven it day in and day out, I agree that there are a lot of issues, as well as Kipling. And I did speak with a CDOT engineer. I attended the meeting at the Wheat Ridge Rec Center regarding the I-70 and Kipling corridor, and I ran into a CDOT engineer, and his daughter and I had actually been on the debate team at Lakewood together, and so we got to chatting about the CFIs, and I discussed a lot of my concerns, much of what I've said thus far about why it wasn't the preferred design in any other communities, and how I think that Wheat Ridge is really being used as a guinea pig, and my concerns with snow removal, plowing, the way that it is handled, as far as a lot of our constituents not really being used to a design of that nature. And I'm not necessarily wanting to rehash all of the design concepts, but it has been a major concern of mine Mr. Matthews prior to that had discussed it. Some of the new council members are expressing their concerns as well. A lot of constituents, business owners along Wadsworth, and I personally am extremely uncomfortable with eminent domain. When you had said that it makes negotiations more constructive, it's kind of a situation of David and Goliath with, it's not a matter of if you're going to take the property, it's a matter of when, and we're really only talking about for how much. And I understand the just compensation is really what the conversation comes down to, but I think some of these property owners would rather not relinquish their property, but they understand that they don't have a choice, and when we're invoking eminent domain, we're going to take it at the end of the day no matter what. So I am very, very concerned with this issue, and I think that, this is the third time around that you've come to ask for permission to invoke eminent domain, and, it's a little condescending that we continue to talk about eminent domain 101 as if we aren't aware of the situation and what it invokes, but yeah, I'm not sitting well with this whole situation, to be honest.
Well, Ms. Dozman, I apologize if you feel this is condescending, and that's not the intent. Again, there's four new council members here, and we want to make sure that they understand the process, and there are significant consequences of not moving forward in a timely fashion, and that's, in the end, that is your decision. You cannot approve eminent domain. We could go back and look at a new design. I think Mr. Westbury explains very well why the double left turn lanes don't work, and the Federal Highway Administration won't fund this project if we go in that design. We tried to find the design that's going to work. We feel the longest down the road, but again, I understand it can be a very touchy subject with eminent domain, and but I think that graphic that Mark did show up there is very telling. It's Arvada and Wheat Ridge made changes on both ends of Wadsworth and their communities. If we don't want to make the changes, we're not going to fix the traffic issues on Wadsworth.
Sorry, just to follow up on that, why is it that we are implementing CFIs when the other communities that have widened Wadsworth aren't?
So CFIs are a relatively new intersection type. They're what is in sort of the category of innovative intersections. People have struggled with this situation of intersections with big left turning volumes for decades. One of the things that the Colorado Springs has always did when they ran that, they just grade separated, and that cost like $40 to $50 million to grade separate roadways. And so they've actually started doing CFIs. They put one in place in December of 17, and they had at least two more in the works. Besides, not counting the two that we've got, there's 5 other CFI locations in the metro area that are in the planning stages and soon to start construction. There's one at Gun Club and Peoria, I believe it is, or Quincy, Gun Club in Quincy. There's 2 on US 85 on Santa Fe as it heads into Highlands Ranch, because they got so many people pulling off of Santa Fe to go into Highlands Ranch. They're putting a much larger CFI than we have in place. We have a pretty simple CFI because we just have that single left turn lane. So if you think about the double left situation, I used to live at 44th and Zephyr. I was Rachel's neighbor. She stalked my flowers when I lived over there. But there was oftentimes, if a pedestrian hit that signal at 44th and Wadsworth, 3 cars were able to turn left. And if that happened a couple of times in a row, then the left turning traffic was backed up for the entire quarter-mile left turn lane to get through there. If no peds hit that, then 8 cars were able to get through there. Well, we talked to the CDOT traffic folks, and they said, on average, a pedestrian hits that signal every other cycle during the peak hour. So it's a really heavily used pedestrian route. And so that's the issue, is that left turning volume. Even if we put double lefts in at 44th and Wadsworth, we're still only getting 6 cars through when the pedestrians hit that cycle. From a right-of-way standpoint, the overall, because we're doing a single left CFI, the overall right-of-way needed for that is not much bigger than what's needed for a double left having the double left in the middle, because we're only building 1 lane of left turning traffic. Now there's a little bit of extra room for medians and stuff, but the overall width of that right-of-way isn't that much different. Now, because of the skewed nature of it on those individual properties, in this case the southwest corners and the northeast corners of those intersections, those guys do have an extra bit of room there because the left turns on their side. So that Mr. Lesher has a bigger impact than Walgreens has, for instance. We do have, you talked about his visual with the 25-foot tape. That was really good. but we're not taking 25 feet from everybody. In front of Safeway, the back of sidewalk's basically not moving. So for that almost that entire distance, we're taking no right-of-way from the McDonald's, Safeway, Boston Market, and then Burger King. The Corners has already dedicated the right-of-way we needed for what's happening on their side. So we've got a lot of places where we're not having a very big impact on right-of-way. Our biggest right-of-way impact is on that very large lot, residential property opposite the Lutheran Church, because we had to shift the road over so far. They're losing, and I don't know the number, it's 30 or 40 feet. So
Have the snow removal issues been addressed?
we're still working with the CDOT maintenance folks on that, on how to get that left turn lane cleared out. We've not resolved that yet, but they do have these in Utah, which gets a lot of snow also. And like I said, they're building 5 more of these in our metro area. And so they've got one in Loveland they've had up there for, gosh, it's been like 3 or 4 years now that Loveland's had theirs. And the Springs has opened one up, and they get similar snowfall to us. So we're gonna reach out to those folks. We've been really focused on getting the environmental assessment part finished. So that's part of our follow-up with CDOT, is to deal with the snow removal part of that.
And in your professional opinion, do you think that the right-of-way acquisition would be less or more with the CFI design?
It's similar. I will use the word similar. Now, because of that displaced left turn on those 4 properties is probably more than if we did double lefts. But on the other hand, on the property opposite, that is probably less. At one point, we were impacting First Bank really, really badly. Like, they're losing the entire row of parking. And because of using the CFI and the adjustments we've made with the value engineering process, we're impacting them a lot less. And so they're impacted less as a result of where we landed. So there's a lot of give and take as we charge north through this, and the road wiggles some in order to try to reduce impacts in places. Because the Corners had already dedicated the right-of-way, we thought, for a wider section. When we drew our new section in, we've wiggled the road a little bit, and we've reduced the impacts to all the properties on the east side. So 7-Eleven and some of those other properties are having a less of an impact than we originally thought.
Thank you, Ms. Hoppy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just would like to try to remind us that, we're here to talk about eminent domain, not necessarily to get in the weeds with design specifics. And also to keep in mind that the 2 properties that we're talking about, one of them who are looking at maybe an alternate situation like the Midas, but prior to that, their attorney suggested that the city go ahead and file an eminent domain petition. And then the other one with the Raleigh Bertos, a 40% higher evaluation is a big miss. It's a big gap. And so to make sure that they are actually getting proper value, I think it's appropriate for us to have a third-party unknown that can, because maybe the way the third party sees it, maybe they do end up getting much closer to that 40% gap closed in higher. But, I think it's important that we give them the opportunity to be able to have that gap filled. So I know that there's really no consensus needed for today, but I'd just like to say thank you to Mr. Westerberg for being here.
Yeah, and I was not going to come back and ask again for the authorization tonight, so I was not going to do that. I got the message loud and clear last time. But I did Ms. Nosler-Beck specifically asked for us to come back, and when we were doing the council orientation, she said, we'd like to hear the city side because I've experienced eminent domain before, and so we'd like to hear what it's like to hear from the government side of things.
Well, no, but the point is, though, Mark, right, this potential is, these 2 properties are potentially coming back on January 13th. So
yes.
we want to make sure that you're aware of that if we want to move forward with these 2 properties, we probably need to do it by January 13th.
Ms. Hulteen?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have a technical question. Would this fall under ex parte communications if we end up bringing it to council? Is it quasi judicial? Oh man, I wait. All right, I need a do-over. Let's go find him. No. But when he gets back, it's just dawned on me since
We will find the answer out.
It's just done by resolution. It's not a public hearing.
It's not a public hearing. It's just a resolution. It's just
I don't believe it is, but we can double check when he comes back.
it's a public meeting, but it's not a public hearing. So there's that nuance.
And I would just be curious, since we are a halfway new council since this last came up. I do appreciate the additional information. It certainly adjusted sort of my perspective on what eminent domain is. Most of what we're talking about is actually in my district, and this is incredibly pertinent to the conversations I've been having with my constituents. I'm just curious from a process standpoint, how it would change if eminent domain was authorized for the 66 partial properties. So like, how would that change what happens between now and our next critical deadline?
So the big difference in my mind, because I am not going to go file a petition for eminent domain on somebody without coming and letting you guys know first. I'm not going to, to me, that's not being transparent. So the big difference would be is if council at some point, just a huge giant what if between now and June said, we're going to go ahead and give you authority to eminent domain, to use eminent domain on the 66 parcels should you need to, if you guys gave me that authority. Then what it would change is at some point in mid-June or so, we'd come to you in a study session and say, we want to give you an update on the right away. We've bought 40 of them. We've got 20 we're still working on. We've got 6 that we're just stuck. And our plan is at the end of June to file eminent domain petitions on those 6, and we brief you on what those are and that kind of thing. So that's that. I'm so sad Jerry's not here. That's door number 1, if you will, of what we would do under that path. If we just stay the course of where we are now, and the plan is to come back to you at the last meeting in June and say, we've got 40 of them are bought, 20 we're in process, we're making great progress, we think we'll have those done, there's 6 we're stuck on. I need a resolution from you to vote on right now for me to give me authority to file eminent domain on those 6 properties. So from a schedule standpoint, it's not a giant problem. It just becomes a lot more personal, if you will, in June if we go down that path. And when I've talked with, and not just Greg, but with other right-of-way consultants, HC Peck is another firm that we've used on all of our previous projects, and they've always advised me to get that resolution authorizing the use of eminent domain ahead of time, because what happens a lot of times is we're at that 9th, 11th hour, if you will, and we've got to file within a couple of weeks to keep our schedule, and we'll come to council and talk about it. And, the public, those folks that we're about to file on may come too and plead their case and do things. And what he says often happens, the council says, why don't you guys go work on it a few more weeks and then come back? And that happens 3 or 4 times because, telling us to go, and I understand Ms. Dozman's hesitation in using eminent domain. I don't want to use it either. I haven't had to so far. But at the end of the day, it may be necessary. He mentioned that 20% of the time you end up getting to the point that you file eminent domain. We've got 66 parcels. That would mean 13 parcels we might have to do that on. I really hope that doesn't happen. I hope we can come to a consensual agreement with everybody. But we've just got a lot of them, and there's a pretty good chance we're going to have somebody that we're going to reach an impasse on. And it really saddens me that our very first 2, we may be at that point. That we've got to use eminent domain to get those to move forward, and again, to find something, because I can't in good conscience just say, well, we're just going to give the Raleigh Bertos folks $200,000 more and call it good, because that to me is, from what my appraiser is saying, I'm wasting taxpayer dollars. And so I can't do that. What Midas is asking for is if he has to go buy a new business somewhere, a building that's already occupied, he may have to buy the business as well as the property, and that may cost him $600,000. And so he wants a little caveat in his deal that give me the $600,000, and I just can't do that either. So those are 2 cases where I'm struggling with trying to use our money really wisely and still at the end of the day justly compensate these folks for what we're doing to them.
Thank you, Ms. Nosler-Beck.
Thanks, and thank you so much for this presentation. It's really helpful. I just want to make sure that we're staying really focused on the personal side of this too.
Yep.
That my family was impacted by eminent domain, and it's just incredibly serendipitous that it was actually to put in the interchange that is similar to a CFI at the Superior and 36 exit. Our property was put under eminent domain to acquire that property to make the whole interchange work. And so now I'm on council for just this short of amount of time, and it's already happening again. And I want to I haven't had a chance to talk to the owners at Raleigh Bertos, but for example, I've been to Raleigh Bertos probably 20 times, and I didn't know the name of it, but I knew it was the place on Wadsworth. And I think that that's where you get to that space where their valuation of the property is, they need to be able to move somewhere that they're going to still be able to have their clientele. And when we get into this legalese of what all of these definitions are, the personal story is that component. And these are the businesses that made it work when Wadsworth wasn't working for them. I mean, that's a hard corner to turn into. And we weren't really there to help them as they built their business, but they still did. And one of the things in the presentation was that, we need to make sure we're protecting those taxpayer dollars. And I completely understand that. I don't want to overpay. I want to give fair market value for that piece of property. But I also want to give a fair deal to the businesses that helped our community get to where we are right now.
Sure.
And so I just am, if we ever are taken, and I appreciate you not pushing any residents or any property owners in Wheat Ridge up to this point to have to be, I'm not finding the word, inflicted with eminent domain, but I would love it if we could find a way to not have to use it.
Sure, and I would too. And so I've got a big feeler side to me, so I get the personal issues and all these things, but I also take my role as the project manager, because that is my job on this project, is to be the project manager for the city. So I worry about the schedule, I worry about the costs, I worry about the design, I worry about all those things that are engineering and financial and all that stuff, other stuff related. And Greg's got a great team of folks that get in there and talk to the people and try to understand what's really going on there and stuff as we're going through this process. And so the one gal is really great. She speaks 3 languages. So if we've got a couple of folks in the corridor that English is not their primary language, she's been a great resource to be able to talk with them in their native tongue so that they really understand what's going on. Because when we give them our brochure, those of us that speak English as a native language don't always understand the brochure. And so she's able to go in and explain that to them. We had a great meeting with the people at Agua Calientes, is that their name now? Because it used to be something else. And they're not native English speakers, but she was able to come along and speak to them in Spanish. I know enough to really be dangerous. And it was just great. Their faces lit up. They were able to really interact with her and interchange, and they really understood what was going on then when she was able to explain to it. So that's the personal touch we're trying to provide, is that we're trying to really meet everyone at their level and do what we need to do. But I also take my role as the project manager really seriously, that I need to keep this thing moving forward and do it for a reasonable cost. This is a $45 million project right now, and we think we've got every penny spent. So we're trying to be really careful with how we spend those dollars.
Well, just as, recently elected, this is something that I care a lot about, and I want to make sure that as a council, we always have a voice too, and when we're going to move forward with this. So I appreciate the presentation tonight, and thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As we look at this, at one point you'd indicated that the 2 full acquisitions, are they on a critical path or are they not?
They're not on the critical path, but they could get that way really quickly depending on how quickly we can get them relocated and stuff.
Okay. So that aspect of it tells me personally that the going forward with eminent domain at this point isn't necessarily critical towards us moving forward. Now, as it relates to the partial acquisitions, I see us moving forward on these full acquisitions as kind of a threat to the partial acquisitions to say, this is what will happen to you if you don't, toe the line. So, and that may be a perfectly acceptable strategy, but I want to make sure that we're going about this appropriately and methodically. I don't think that a discrepancy in the appraisals is necessarily flawed or otherwise nefarious. It's just that's one licensed appraiser's opinion of it, and this is another's, and maybe the eminent domain process is the best way to go forward on that, but it doesn't sound like at this point that it's critical for that eminent domain process to go forward on these 2 full acquisitions. Now, as it relates to the partial acquisitions and the CFIs, I think that a big contention here is going to be on those partial acquisitions, is that those property owners do not like the CFIs, and it may not necessarily be the value, it may be the design that they're holding back on. So you could bring 100 appraisers in there, and that's not going to solve the design issue for those property owners. And so as we look at, what's going to hold us back or what's going to push this logjam forward, it's, I think, understanding that, telling us that the Federal Highway Administration wouldn't approve of a double left turn lane doesn't compute with the Planning and Environmental Linkages Study, which shows a final recommended alternative with 2 double left turn lanes. So a double left turn lane is a viable alternative. It is something that is not precluded by anybody else but ourselves. So I think we need to seriously consider doing away with the CFIs and moving forward with the double left-hand turn lane. And that, I think, would help us with the right-of-way acquisitions.
Well, Mr. Urban, I don't know if that was the fact. I mean, the PEL was very early on in the process, and yes, the double left turn lane was part of that, but the CFIs came after the fact, after traffic studies were done, correct, Mark? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, so the PEL process, as we move forward with that, CDOT, for better or for worse, and we think for worse, was just not paying very close attention, except the people we were directly dealing with in the process. And they didn't do a great job of letting everyone else know at CDOT what was moving forward. We got to the 11th hour on that project, and the CDOT folks came up and said, hey, we can't approve this project the way it is. We can't move forward with this. And so a decision was made, because we'd been awarded the grant to move forward with the design and construction, the decision was made to go ahead and wrap up the PEL and just finish it the way it was and accept it. And then there was a laundry list of issues with that design from CDOT's standpoint. And so we wrapped up the PEL, we adopted it as a guiding document for moving forward, and then we moved forward with the environmental assessment. We spent 9 to 12 months. The first part of the environmental assessment was just trying to deal with that laundry list of issues. And during that time period, we wrote a transition report that resulted at the end of that, where the CFIs, this simplified CFI design, did rise the top from the 40-plus things that we started with as the preferred alternative for this corridor. And that's what we've been charging ahead with ever since, because that's what rose to the top as the thing that, from an engineering standpoint, worked the best. And I get people's hesitation with it. And I've told some of you who heard this story. When we first started this, I was really hesitant about the CFI. I was like, this seems really kind of bizarre and weird. I'm nervous about it. And we found out there was one in Loveland, so we drove up to Loveland. We put 6 of us in a city van and drove up there. I drove, and I'm the worst driver there is. And I had no trouble navigating that CFI except one thing, right where the left turn was, they had another left turn going in the backside of Sam's. And I said, we're not doing that on this project. And so we've avoided that on this project. The folks at 3 Acre Lane really wanted a left turn going into their thing, but to do that would have been a similar situation. And that was the only time I got confused driving that CFI. And the difference was they did great signage. Now, when they first opened that CFI, and we've heard from Colorado Springs too, when they first opened the one in the Springs, their switchboards lit up with people complaining about them. But about a month later, it just got dead silent because everybody sort of figured it out. There's a learning curve involved. There certainly is. But people figured it out really quickly, and then they were able to adapt their driving habits and what they did, and the complaints went away. So I understand the hesitation on the CFIs. And again, if council wants us to come back and make a presentation on CFIs, I'd be more than happy to do that. But if we go back to put double Fs in, I've got to stop right-of-way acquisition dead in its tracks, because the right-of-way needs for the double Fs is very different from the CFIs because of how those are built. And so I've got to stop right-of-way acquisition dead in its tracks. I've got to stop design dead in its tracks, and we've probably got to restart the environmental process. And that's going to delay us to the point that we have the risk of losing our federal funding. And I just don't want to take that risk. And I personally think the CFIs are the best option because of all the things that I've learned about them and how they're going to work on this corridor. There are some real advantages to having CFIs here. I know that Ms. Dozeman, you mentioned, why didn't they use CFIs in Lakewood? Well, again, they're a relatively new intersection type. Those weren't available when Colfax was done. That wasn't one of the things that was on the option list when Colfax and Wadsworth were done, and all those other intersections down in Lakewood. So it's a relatively new intersection, but like I said, there's at least 5 more in the metro area, and the Springs is planning on doing several. So it's a relatively new thing, but it's a very, very successful and useful thing.
Thank you, Ms. Hutchinson.
Thank you, Mr. Whoops, sorry. About the eminent domain, I thought there were 2 properties that we had a question about. All the other properties are on board. Is that yes or no?
Sort of.
Okay.
We have two full acquisitions that we started early. Now, in the environmental assessment, if you read that, we had 8 properties listed as potential full acquisitions. But because of what we did during value engineering and our meetings with those individual property owners, we've determined that we think we've designed our way out of having to acquire those other 6. Now, a couple of those are still on the fence, but we're working with those property owners to stay where they are because they want to stay where they are. And so, for instance, First Bank of the West is one of those. They're going to lose where their teller is, where their drive-through is, and they're going to lose all the parking on the one side of their building. We thought, well, that's a no-brainer. That's a full acquisition. They said, no. We can move the drive-through to the other side. It used to be over there, and we have a parking agreement with Pep Boys, so it's not an issue. We want to stay at this corner. This is a great corner for us. And so again, we've taken our list of potential full acquisitions from 8 down to just 2 that we're pretty sure of, and one of those may actually go away. So, to do a project this size and maybe only have 1 or 2 full acquisitions is a pretty incredible thing.
So,
That's not, I'm sorry, I was just going to say that to follow up, to answer your question, that's not to say that some of the parcel tax property owners we don't have issues with. I mean.
Oh, no. So, yeah, for the other 66, we've just started the process. We don't know. Well, we've heard from a few folks that are like, I'm really upset about what you're doing. I said, I understand. And we're gonna work with you to try to mitigate that, and we'll help you do design on your property to mitigate our impacts to you and do all those things. And we'll do all those things. I've designed a lot of parking lots in my life, and so I've been helping people figure out what to do with their parking lots. We were able to get First Bank where they actually gained some spaces, even though we're taking a bunch of frontage from them, just by reconfiguring their parking lot. So we're going to try to help all these folks work through that.
well, is it true that Wheat Ridge has not, eminent domain before? In 50 years?
I've done 3 other federal aid projects since my time here. I did the Kipling Trail, I did Tabor Street south of Ridge Road, and I did the trail out in front of Wadsworth, and then a median project in front of Red Lobster. On 2 of those, we didn't have to acquire right-of-way, so it was no big deal. But on the Kipling project, we got very close to eminent domain on 3 properties. One was the property owner died, and the bank that foreclosed on the property, and then the daughter couldn't keep up the payments, so the bank foreclosed on it. We couldn't get the bank to respond. That's the one where I tell you we made it to the courthouse steps. We filed a petition. We were at the courthouse steps to go into the immediate possession hearing, and the attorney from the bank suddenly showed up and said, "We'll do the deal. We'll take your deal." We didn't understand. So we had an uncooperative property owner. When he hired his attorney looked at what he was doing and said, "This is crazy. You need to take the city's deal. It's a pretty good deal." And so that one went away too. The third one was the absentee owner thing, where there was a remnant piece of property where the Rocky Mountain ditch is, and there was no owner. We finally found a person who was like 93 years old in a nursing home, and she was doing really well, but she was in a nursing home. She was the sole surviving heir of the original property owner from like 80 years ago. And we found her, and we made the deal, and we did that. But that was another case where we thought we were going to do eminent domain because we just literally couldn't find the person that owned the property.
But it's never been approved before eminent domain, is that correct?
On the other 3 projects, council gave me authorization to use eminent domain. We never made it all the way to an IP hearing or evaluation trial.
Okay, so.
It's not been used by the city to acquire property on a project since I started 12 years ago. I can't speak to what happened before that.
So approving eminent domain, that's not a blanket thing from now on that the city can just do this whenever they want?
No. The council has the option to approve me to do it on just these 2 properties or on this project or however, or to say, nope, come back to us each time and talk to us, which is where we're at today.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions for Mr. Westberg? Okay, Mr. Westberg.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. We're going to take about a 10-minute recess before we move into our number 3rd item. reconvene our study session, and we will move to agenda item number 3. This is the noise ordinance. Mr. Goff, would you please introduce this item?
You bet, I'd be happy to. Let's talk about some noise. Woohoo! Never a fun topic, and we had some speakers here this evening, and they mentioned what their concerns were, and that is why we're here this evening, because we've had, are you two done chatting over here?
Not yet.
Because we've had some, we occasionally get complaints about noise, and one recently was from a manufacturing operation, and we'll talk about that here in a second. I got an update on that, the Rocky Mountain Bottle Company. But most recently, with our speakers this evening, the complaints are coming from a commercial district, which we had these same complaints back in 2012, and as the speaker said, it's been kind of an ongoing issue for them. So we brought this issue to City Council on September 23rd. But again, similar to the Wadsworth project and the right-of-way, we have 4 new council members, and we got limited direction that evening. The direction that we did get that evening was to bring back some type of hybrid approach on dealing with noise in the community. So we'd like to get some more direction tonight and update the current, or the new city council on this. So a little bit of history. In 2005, that's when the city council at that time repealed what we currently had on the books of disturbing the peace ordinance. That was very difficult to enforce at that time. It was, as some of the speakers even mentioned, very subjective. The language, the standard in the code then was noise enforcement was at a sound at such a level or at such an hour as to disturb the peace of any other person. So very difficult to enforce. So council repealed that in 2005 and adopted unnecessary noise and disturbing the peace ordinance. And it made it a little bit more objective by adding distance requirements. So noise was deemed unreasonable if the sound was audible within 25 feet or more from the noise or sound source. The ordinance also dealt with noise in multi-unit apartment buildings, and trash pickup could only be between certain hours. And it also allowed that a police officer could act as the complaining party in the prosecution of the case. That was not allowed in our code before. So that's what's been on the books since 2005. 2012, City Council brought this up specifically because of the issue that the speaker spoke about this evening, the noise emanating from a restaurant bar along 44th Avenue. A draft ordinance was drafted at that time. It actually went to public hearing, second reading, and that ordinance was bringing forward a special permit program for amplified sound. So that was kind of specifically referring to this business because they had music and out on their patio. And so we went through that process, went to public hearing, but that ultimately was postponed indefinitely. And I honestly don't remember the reasoning of why. It was a unanimous vote, 8-0, to kill that bill at second reading. So, and then as I mentioned, September 23rd, we brought this up again, and the direction at that time was to bring back some type of ordinance that is more of a hybrid approach between subjective and objective. So maybe, and that could be done a lot of different ways, maybe based on zoning areas in the city, maybe based on types of noise, the noise source, where it's coming from. So that's something, if the council still wants to move in that direction, we can speak about. A little bit more background on noise specifically. I looked at personally about 50 different ordinances in different communities, and they're all over the place. And some are very, very complicated. I would recommend that we don't go as complicated as some of the cities. Some are very simple, as ours is today. They're either really qualitative or really quantitative. Some of them have some hybrid approaches to it. And you can see we actually put a graphic in your memo too that shows what the decibel levels are for different sounds in the community. So if you wanted to go to a decibel level as a standard for measuring sound or noise, these are some examples. Common normal conversation is about 55 to 60 decibel level. And I think one of the speakers mentioned that once you get over 85, hearing protection is recommended. And a lot of this depends on a lot of different things. It's depending on ambient noise, that's other noise that's in the area. It's dependent on wind frequency, if it's, how long the noise is emanating. So it's even if you do want to implement some type of more objective decibel reading, there's a lot of factors involved on how those measures are taken. So I think Mr. Keller suggested that maybe we bring in an expert. I would suggest that if council wants to take this further into a more detailed, objective ordinance, that we bring somebody in that can help us put the code together that it would be enforceable. And your memo includes what our current code says. I mentioned again that we included in 2005 that any noise or sound which is audible 25 feet or more from a mobile device or 25 feet or more from the noise source is deemed unreasonable. A lot of the codes that I found that use that similar approach, 25 is a fairly small distance. Most codes were at least 50 or 100. So that's something that maybe we could talk about if you want to keep our current level of standard in place. Also, under the recommendations, I put a typical table in your memo that a lot of ordinances have when they're using a more quantitative approach, and they break down your community into different land uses. So this is a very simple one that's broken down by residential, commercial, industrial. It has different time frames of when the noise is measured and what the decibel limits are in that community. So it goes anywhere between 50 in a residential to 80 in an industrial area. So with that, I just wanted to briefly, before we start discussion, one of the other noise issues that we were having in our community recently, again, was with the Rocky Mountain Bottle Company. For you new council members, if you're not aware of this, they recently made some improvements to their plant. You all familiar with where that is, right? Up in the northwest corner of Wheat Ridge. It's a 24 hours, 7-day operation, I believe. And so it's been there for quite some time. But they made some improvements to their manufacturing system. They put in a new furnace and what they call an oxygenator. I can never say that, oxygenator. And it was really some of it was in response to some issues that they had to deal with the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. They were emitting too many contaminants into the air, so they had to upgrade their systems. So they installed all these new equipment at a great expense, and then we started getting complaints from the neighborhood that it was noisier than normal. So we've been working with them for several months now, and I just got this today. This is just a short update from them. On where they're at, they're essentially, in summary, they said that they are finished with their improvements to deal with the noise. They believe it's lessens or decreased the noise substantially. I haven't heard any complaints in the last few months. It's bitter cold out, has been, so people probably have their windows closed a lot more than they did this summer. So I'm not sure if the PD has had any, if Dave has any ideas about complaints that code enforcement may be receiving. But so this, hopefully this issue is being addressed up at the Rocky Mountain Bottle Company. We still need to stay on top of it and make sure that it is being handled. But they have put significant money into making improvements, insulating the furnace area so that it's decreasing some of the noises that have been emanating from that plant. So we still potentially may have some issues up there in an industrial area, but as you heard from the speakers this evening, we have potential issues in residential, bordering commercial areas that we need to address. So I may just stop there and open it up for questions, or if we have Chief Pickett, Interim Chief Pickett here, and then also Jerry Dahl, who's been doing some research on this, and we're all here to help with the discussion to see where we can take this.
Okay, we're close. Ms. Weaver.
I was just curious, is there a difference between noise like on the patio of something and amplified music versus inside, or it's just measured from across the street? Or does that make sense? Like, is there inside versus
Based
outside?
on our current ordinance or just in general?
Or just sort of how any of you look at it? I mean, or are there rules that say, as long as it's enclosed, right? Because sometimes that particular business has music inside,
Yeah.
sometimes it's outside.
Well, based on our code, if you can hear it 25 feet away, it's deemed unreasonable.
Regardless, inside or outs.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Ms. Hulteen?
I have a question kind of along the lines of that. When we're talking about differentiation between residential and commercial, if the sound is emanating from a commercial district but being measured in a residential district, how does that work?
A lot of ordinances that I saw, the chart's a little bit different than the one that's in your memo. They have a column for both source of noise, what district it's coming from, and then what district the noise is being heard in. So, and they're measured differently. So, once you cross the line, like if you have a residential neighborhood right next to industrial neighborhood, the industrial can be emanating maybe 80, based on this chart, decibels, as long as it stays in their boundaries. But if you go on the boundary of the residential property across the street and you're measuring it and it's still 80, that's a violation.
Ms. Hoppy?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think that the city of Arvada did a pretty decent job with their hybrid, so to speak. So they had, kind of the general noise ordinance, and then they went into the PUD, the Planned Urban Development, although I don't know what CC stands for, though. But they went into their PUD and their PUD-CC and put limits on days and nights. But as far as, in my mind, as far as hybrid goes, I think that kind of industrial would be the only area that I would want to do decibel measurements on, because we have an opportunity where even if something's under the decibels, if it's unreasonable, then the officers at this point have the opportunity to say, please go turn that down. Now, with the proposed, with the draft ordinance that we have, I have a few questions about it. So,
The City of Wheat Ridge draft ordinance?
yes,
That was the one.
attachment 6.
That was the one from 2012. I was showing that as an example of what we've been
I
through.
thought that's what you were offering us.
No, we didn't draft an ordinance.
Because I had a lot of questions about it.
Sorry.
Yet to come.
I just wanted to show you where we've been and decisions we haven't made yet.
Okay, well then let me regroup instead of
That was the amplified sound
digging into
permit
the one
process.
that's not presented as a draft. So I'll get back to you.
Thank you. Ms. Hutchinson?
I think we do need to consider noise in residential areas. There are some new homes that are not too far from where I'm at that are like the 3 stories with the flat roof. And if they end up having a party up on the very top, I could hear the words in the music 2 blocks away. So that's just having a party in a neighborhood. Of course, it was summer and windows were open. Okay, I wouldn't hear it now. But we do need to think, I believe, about residential areas, and the higher the buildings are, that sound goes straight. I mean, they're like taller than trees. So there wasn't any wind or anything. It's just the way it flows. There's nothing to block it. And I do like the idea of time. I thought it was 11 o'clock at night for a noise ordinance, but this says 10.
Yeah, and that's all over the place too. That's another way a lot of cities I noticed, they've just based on hours also. And the speaker we had earlier about landscaping equipment, that's typically an exception in most ordinances, that landscaping equipment is exempted from a noise ordinance. But I understand, Mr. Dahl and I were talking, I don't like the leaf blowers either, but most cities do exempt those, or they require that they have to be done between at least certain hours of the day, right?
Ms. Dozeman?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I wanted to thank staff for bringing this back to our attention. Mr. Matthews and I had asked that it be added to an agenda because of the Rocky Mountain Bottling Company, and also the business that was spoken about earlier is also in our district. So this is a very prevalent issue in District 4. I I would really like an expert to come in and be able to discuss an objective manner in measuring decibels and how far and those issues. And while I do want to alleviate some of the nuisances to our residential areas, I also want to ensure that we are maintaining, and I don't know whether it'd be an exemption, and I did see something about public events. So, you know, the Carnation Festival, the events at Ridge at 38, I know that those decibel levels are above what this is, and I also wanted to thank you for the visual. I was actually really surprised at how high of decibels some of the some of the equipment like lawnmowers run at. I was actually really surprised to see that. So I wanted to thank you for giving that visual, because I think it gave me a better idea of what kind of like how loud we're thinking. And I understand the hybrid as far as an unreasonable noise complaint, but at the same time, I think that having an objective measurement would be really beneficial for us moving into the future.
Thank you, Ms. Weaver.
I was just curious, how does something like highway noise fall into something like this? Because, you know, I think most of us can hear I-70 from anywhere in Wheat Ridge, and sometimes it's very loud. So how does that sort of then go with something like ambient noise?
That's part of the ambient noise, the background noise, which I think you need to, the research that I've done anyway, that becomes kind of part of the baseline noise in the area.
Gotcha. So it starts with the baseline of what normal is for that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And please, Mr.
Chief
Pickett, if
Pickett?
you have anything to add.
So one problem with doing anything that has a specific measurement is it's a little bit like Mr. Westberg talked about with how appraisals are done, is who's doing the measuring and what does that measurement mean? And certainly we've run into this problem. We run into this problem occasionally, even when we're using very well-established technology like radar or laser in measuring speed. Is that in court, people say, okay, well, these are the factors that you're not taking into consideration, and therefore your measurement is no longer valid. So, you know, I just want to make sure that everybody recognizes that when we go to, you know, this objective measurement, it's maybe not as objective as we would all like. It's still something that we have to be able to prove in court. And when we have calibrated decibel meters that we're using, that you know, the police department will have to go through certification processes and those things, and then it's still not something that everybody is going to accept as the decibel measurement.
Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As it currently stands, have we ever prosecuted someone for a noise violation or threatened to, you know, if we haven't been able to prosecute, we at least got somewhere with it?
So the short answer is yes. So when you have a subjective measure, then what you base your prosecution on is testimony. Now, prior to the 2005 change, the city required a non-police complainant, and that was extremely difficult. People were intimidated by the process, and sometimes intimidated by the entity that was making the noise. You made mention of parties. Well, some parties are more benign than others. So the police department really had an ordinance that really wasn't working. When it got to the point where a police officer could then go into court and say, we were called to this area, we determined where the noise was emanating from, and then this is what we observed, then that officer's ability to articulate the situation really went to either the court or the jury's determination of whether that burden of proof was met. And we have prosecuted that on numerous occasions, and some we win and some we lose.
Sure. And I guess just as a follow-up to that, what we're trying to do is modify behavior. We're trying to say that all volume buttons only go up to 10 and not to 11, and we're trying to change their behavior. But I see we're trying to get to this perfect point where we have an airtight case on a noise ordinance, but in reality, that's just sort of the big stick. But we're not. We're not using it that often to go that full 100 yards or whatever. We're only using it as sort of a behavior modification.
So obviously, as everybody knows, Wheat Ridge Police Department is a community-oriented police department. That's how we try to handle issues, is we try to handle those through mediation, often using the officer on scene at the time, and try and come to some sort of understanding so that everybody's needs are met. And then we write a violation when one party is just not going to follow a reasonable societal standard.
Sure.
Mr. Stites?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One of the things that I think both of the Kellers touched on was making sure that if we're going to go to that objective standard of, say, it's got to be 50 decibel or whatever it is, that we don't set that too high, because that can be used as a double-edged sword too. That if it's so loud that it's still bothering the neighbors, but it's within that acceptable tolerance, that's an issue too. So maybe some sort of a hybrid, or keeping the officer's ability to mitigate that on site would be a good idea.
Now, I did see one code that kind of did that, Mr. Stites, where they said that I think they set decibel levels, but they first left it up to the reasonable standards of the officers, and they could go there and try to mitigate it, but they could pull out their reader if they had to, I guess, if nobody was satisfied or something. But so that was kind of a hybrid approach I saw in one city.
Additional discussion, Ms. Weaver.
So does that include things like vehicles without mufflers and things like that? Because, I think everyone has their thing that they don't like the noise from. And you hear one that you don't hear what you like, and you hear what you don't like. And so I was just curious, what does that have to do? Like this is why I keep bringing up the highway noise. What's the difference between a really loud whatever driving by my house on 38th versus music from a party? And does that make any sense? Like, can we?
Yeah, it does make sense, because we do get complaints, usually in the summertime, usually associated with motorcycles. So here's the situation with that is when we're dealing with transient noise, if person A's motorcycle is audible for 30 seconds, what culpability do they have in overall highway noise? So I would get, a lot of times we would get complaints from people. We had a gentleman on Sheridan who was particularly impacted by motorcycle noise, but which motorcycle? And so we really didn't have a way to take a major corridor's noise level down, because what does become viewed as unreasonable is if I can drive my vehicle in one jurisdiction and I'm traveling to another jurisdiction, but I can't travel through the media jurisdiction because of the noise ordinance. And certainly enforcement is an issue, because if somebody calls and says, hey, we just had a vehicle come through with excessive noise, well, our ability, especially in a jurisdiction the size of Wheat Ridge, to be able to identify that vehicle is limited. And then there's kind of the expectation that we have people set there all the time that are supposed to monitor that, and that's not a reasonable use of resources.
Thank you. Ms. Hulteen?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This conversation reminds me of when I was getting my master's in biology and we were doing desert work and I could choose between birds and plants. And it was a lot easier to do the plants because they just sat there. You could look at them as long as you needed to. And it seems like the noise ordinance kind of, follows some of these same challenges. As we're thinking about this, and I'm just such a systematic thinker, and I'm thinking, the Rocky Mountain bottling plant is like a plant. It's a plant, and it's like a plant, in that it's consistent. It's there. It's really easy to, understand this is where this noise is emanating from. It's got a really, identifiable and accountable party. So regulating in industrial areas seems like it's a little bit more straightforward. And then as we start getting into commercial and then, these gray areas where commercial and residential neighborhoods kind of come together, and then residential neighborhoods, we're dealing a lot more with individual behaviors. And it seems to me that a lot of things are opportunistic, right? I'm having a great party next door to Judy Hutchins. And I invited her. But, so we have that neighbor that occasionally, does the wrong thing. And, that's just kind of neighborhoods. And that's, I think, a little bit harder. But when that same neighbor has a party the next weekend and the next weekend and the next weekend, then we have, a trend of behavior that becomes problematic. And so I'm inclined to look at this, one-off instances are hardly, they may bug you that day, but they don't get under your skin. But how are we, if something gets called 3-4 times, could that then trigger a more specific measurement where, the parties, if you get called 3 times for a party or a violation, whatever it is, could then that trigger the quantitative and not the qualitative? Does that make sense? Okay.
Respond to that?
Yes. So again, I want to make sure everybody recognizes that when officers go out to these situations, then what our goal is to mitigate that problem. Let people have their party for this weekend, and let them understand that there is reasonable times and that there's reasonable numbers of occurrences. So when we get what we term a party house, then we start to focus our enforcement. So we use ordinances through police discretion, and then that discretion is then transferred to the court in the event that a case is filed. So we have more success with a specifically written ordinance that we can then use in a reasonable fashion, rather than having the ordinance itself try to specifically guide our decision-making process. Does that make sense? As far as delineating between type of noise, in an enforcement aspect, we have more difficulty explaining to people why their noise is different from another person's noise than we do when we have a specific ordinance where we can say your noise is like everyone else's, and we are going to deal with you like everyone else. First thing we're going to do is try and find a mutually beneficial solution, and then only in the event that someone is unmoving do we use the court process.
Ms. Hoppe?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for that explanation, Chief. When this first came to us, our question was, do you want it qualitative or quantitative? And everybody was kind of like, and so then I made the bad consensus to go hybrid because Patrick's eyes got like this big, so hybrid. And, but what I do think, and I agree with Ms. Hulteen, is when it's in industrial and it's a 24-hour thing and it's ongoing, and that's something that you can measure, and that's something where when it does get excessively, they change stuff and it gets excessively loud, we can say, no, you need to mitigate this back to where it was at. And that is quantitative. But then I also see, like, with the qualitative, as far as like in residential areas, we've got mixed-use neighborhood commercial. We've got commercial 1, C1 is C1 because it is so close to to a residential. And so it's harder, as I can see enforcement-wise, if somebody's having a party at their house every weekend and they're under the number of decibels, then where is there's no enforcement there. However, if they're having a party at their house every weekend, and then the officers can say, we've been here now for every weekend this month, it's time you give your neighbors a break, shut down the party today or whatever, then that gives them room to work with. And so that's kind of where I was thinking of, like, the hybrid approach. But I guess what I'm asking is, where do you guys sit on this? Because we can't, we need to come to a consensus on, do we want qualitative, quantitative, or hybrid? And because we can't really craft anything unless we know where we all have consensus at. And so I'm just kind of wondering, like, where are you guys at as far as other council people? Where are you guys at as far as what road are we going to drive down?
Ms. Dozman?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So this is a question for you as far as, would it be more enforceable or would it be easier on you if there were a quantitative, objective decibel level that you could work within in certain areas? Or, I don't want to make your job harder because you guys already work so hard.
Well, I certainly appreciate that. So as far as enforcement is concerned, neither one is necessarily harder than the other. They both, as the Kellers pointed out, they both have their advantages and they both have their disadvantages. When we're talking about specific decibel levels, then what we have to have is a complaining witness, and we have to have a decibel level as measured a specific way, outlined in ordinance, that we can take to court. The problem with that is that it kind of removes our discretion. It removes our ability to go to the emanating property and say, hey, look, let's all try to be reasonable here. Because if the complaining witness says, hey, this is the violation occurs, and I would like my day in court, we have to kind of listen to that, because that's a constitutional right. If somebody wants to go to court, we got to kind of let them if they have a true case. The flip side of that is that if we use discretion, or if we have a less objective measure, then at what point does an emanating group say, okay, we are specifically being targeted because of the type of noise that we produce or the type of neighbor that we have? And we've actually gone to federal district court over this issue, and now we won, but it was, and we learned some things, but I guess the bottom line is there's probably, even if you go hybrid, there's probably no perfect model, but no matter which direction you go, we're going to continue to try to work it out before the court process begins.
Okay. Additional discussion. Ms. Hutchinson.
I still like the time issue, because I remember the roofers. Okay. They would, even if they could, work after dark. And I'm thinking, how can you even see what you're doing? And they would be there before 7 in the morning. And so I don't know, I've lived here a long time, but I thought even people mowing their lawns or the lawn services couldn't come before 8. And then with the noise, I thought it was like 11 o'clock at night. That kind of is just kind of cut and dried. But I live in an area where unless you live in a very quiet place, you don't know what that is. And I've had people comment many, many times, man, is it ever quiet over here? That's worth $1 million. And, you know, when you have that and then you end up having noise that you're not used to, and it's like after dark, after 11 o'clock, that doesn't seem very respectful, you know, for the neighborhood. And that's something that I would like to see, respect for neighbors.
Thank you. Additional discussion? Ms. Hoppy.
So, well, I would like to make a consensus, but I don't hear one out here, because my question was, do we want to try to go for something that's a hybrid, or do we want to go qualitative or quantitative? And I'd just kind of like to hear what you guys would.
I think Ms. Weaver's got the answer to that question
I don't
right
have
now.
the answer to that question. I know it's more difficult, but I really appreciate you sharing sort of how you deal with this stuff. I know a hybrid does seem more difficult, but it does seem like they're two different things. We're dealing with sort of domestic noise and the issues between neighbors and smaller businesses and neighbors, and then we have the industrial. Like, we can put a decibel level. I remember when we heard the phone recording of the bottling. I mean, that was a really stark thing, and to me, if I were experiencing that, I would want to be able to have a decibel measure for something like that so that one could walk in. And then for the more neighborly issues, to have it be a little bit more, I guess it's, you know, I hate the word objective because it's all really subjective. So, it is that discussion and it's that mediation. I'm also really hesitant about what we call quiet. Okay, we don't live in libraries. And you know, I live at a farm where some people think a farm is really quiet. I think a farm is quite noisy, actually. And it's the noise that you prefer or you don't prefer. And I laugh about that, but it's really true. You hear the music you don't like. You don't hear the music that you like. And I happen to really not like soft jazz. So soft jazz, to me, sounds like the most offensive music on earth. I don't mean any offense to anyone if you like soft jazz. But so I do think it gets really delicate when we talk about what quiet means. And I think hours are a great way to think about, of course, you know, I think we've had that on our books for a while, that if you do have a gathering, you usually get some sort of permit or process. Is there a permit process?
We don't. We attempted that in 2012. That was the draft ordinance that's in your packet for an amplified permit for. So if there was if you're going to have a band at a party or something.
Well, and maybe that sort of goes back to my inside outside stuff, because like at farms, inside noise and outside noise actually makes a difference, because I do run machinery that can be high decibel and I wear ear protection and all of that. But maybe it is more tagged to when we have a business or something, or an isolated party where I know I'm going to have a live band, or I know that there is some sort of like, hey, let your neighbors know, or there's some sort of permit light. And then maybe for a business who's doing that, yes, there's mediation, but then there's also this a reasonableness, a neighborliness about how loud, what are the appropriate times? Maybe it's not every day of every summer day that there's amplified music on the porch, right?
And that was the intent of the ordinance in 2012, was to limit, I don't know if we made that decision on how many permits they could get in 1 year and those different things. I think that's why it failed, because I think the neighborhood asked that we didn't pass that, because then they probably would have to sit through maybe 5 events a year of noise that maybe they didn't want to, because it was going to be permitted.
It's a two-edged sword. Ms. Nosler-Beck.
Thanks, Mayor. So I'm thinking I'm on board with the hybrid approach, because one of the things that, like, when I was knocking doors, I was up by the plant, the bottling plant, and it was loud, just being up there. But also, it was ruining the neighborhood. And I think this is great that the bottling company has, found a way to deal with the issue. But I think that it's so subjective, because it is wintertime and nobody has their windows open, and we don't know if it's actually going to work. And I think that we have to do something that makes it so when summer comes around and if it's still really loud, this isn't just the fix. I think we need to find something to measure the decibels and go that way. I also think that there are some things that we have in place, like what Judy was talking about with the timing and keeping those parameters in place. I think that's something that works, and we should stick with it. And it allows for neighbors to still have a voice in all of it, not just. So anyway, I'm in favor of the hybrid, and I think that we should talk more about the permits, because we said no to that in 2012, it sounds like, but I think that neighbors might be okay with a certain amount of permits or something a year, if we could maybe set a limit or cap on it. I don't know, I just started thinking about that as you brought it up. So anyway, Janice.
There's some input.
Okay. Ms. Dozeman?
Patrick, did you have something to address real quick?
If that's okay, just to jump on a point about the timing that both Judy and Val brought up. Our codes really don't address timing very much, the time frame, so that's, maybe I'm hearing that's something that we want to incorporate. I think our building permits state that you shouldn't do construction work before 7 a.m. and after 7 p.m., but that's about, I think, the only time in our sound ordinance. There's nothing about time except for garbage trucks. So we could add, I'm looking at an ordinance from another city right here, where they, for almost every different type of sound, they have a time frame of what part of the day they can make that sound. So that's something we could look at. Thanks.
Ms. Dozeman?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I agree with the hybrid approach, and with what you were just saying. The first thought that came to my mind as far as addressing that is, because it gets darker so much earlier in the winter, it really is somewhat more of an issue then. I really appreciated you saying that your first approach is to try to mediate and try to come to an agreeable solution, because I'm one of those people that I always address my issues with my neighbors, as opposed to, calling Uncle Sam and trying to get somebody involved. And so I appreciate that approach. And I definitely think that setting a parameter as far as you can't have a certain decibel before or after a time period in the day, I think that's definitely something that we should look at. And as far as decibel levels in the industrial areas, because as I was reading this paragraph, it was saying that they were in compliance with both current Wheat Ridge municipal and state codes, and because we don't really have a strong code in Wheat Ridge, like there was really nothing to be able to enforce. And so I do want something, whether it's a decibel level, a time parameter, and then as far as permits, I think that's a great idea. We have to seek permits for public events, the Carnation Festival, the Ridge at 38, we have to have permits for that, and I would be open to exempting public events that are permitted, and maybe setting a cap on that, or having, you know, live music not being able to go past a certain time, especially if it's in a residential neighborhood. So I too support the hybrid approach.
Ms. Weaver?
I would just say it's not just live music. It is specifically that in the last 10 years, amplifiers are much easier to have on a personal level, and they're very, very loud. And so there's just a difference that has happened in people's ability to broadcast music. And so I would add the word outside amplified. And I'm not saying we never allow it, but I think that's one of the things that carries really vividly through neighborhoods is, you know, shut the windows if you're having a party, you know, like, not that I've ever had a party that the police have come to, but, you know, they
We are rarely invited anywhere.
Chief Pickett,
well, just to clarify with Mr. Urban's comment, my amplifier does go to 11. So.
Chief Pickett, I had a question. If we were to look at a hybrid model on this, so you've got, let's say, some common sense and discretion out there, and then sort of as a backup or as an auxiliary tool, you might have a decibel meter, so that you would be able to utilize both of those tools in an examining situation.
So it really depends on what the final code makes hybrid. If it makes it by zoning district, then not only do we need our meter, we need our zoning map, and that is something that each officer is going to have to make the determination of. So that is certainly one of the issues involved. With the current model, what we'll call the subjective model, certainly more objective points can be put into it. Time limitations, types of noise, because a police officer can make a determination of what is and what is not a trash truck, okay, and what is or what is not lawn maintenance, what is not construction noise. So if you're talking about a hybrid with those types of objective standards involved, then a police officer can make those determinations right there. If when you're saying hybrid is some things will be measured by decibel level and some things will be measured by on the level of reasonableness, then how those two are delineated would have to be pretty specifically outlined in ordinance, because if the noise is emanating from my property, whichever one the complainant says I'm under, I can guarantee you I feel I'm under the other. So the officer on scene would have to be able to make that a very specific delineation.
Ms. Hulteen?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It seems to me that the industrial use with a decibel is still sort of a standalone category, in that it's more fixed, and it'd be a lot easier to determine. Like, we have this issue in an industrial area, it's not as much like a flashpoint. I realize that there can always be exceptions to that, but so from the hybrid approach, it seems to me maybe we could still keep some sort of quantitative regulation within the industrial, since that tends to kind of be a little bit different category. I really appreciate that our police department takes a community policing approach, and I really, always want to, empower our police department to, lead with people and see situations. When I moved here and I found out that you had to have a permit to go sledding in our parks, I was like, what is this, like Footloose? I was like, what kind of town am I living in? And so I think that, over permitting things that are kind of quality of life and make us really appreciate living here, like being able to invite our friends over. So I would look a little differently at the type of ambient noise that's made by people gathering versus things being amplified as being a distinction, because I would love more restaurants with patios to open, and I think most patios are respectful noises. It's when they start amplifying those noises that we kind of run into problems. So looking at hybrid approach, I see a distinction between ambient noise of people versus using, mechanical things that are making amplified noises. And I think that allows our police department to bring their community first policing approach in a way that I think really benefits us. And even though we might all interpret we're on the better side of it when the dispute comes, at the end of the day, I want to default to the police department doing their best.
Thank you, Mr. Stites.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I too in favor of the hybrid approach, and like Ms. Hulteen said, maybe not breaking it down to specific residential, commercial, but definitely industrial and using the decibel meter there. And then going to some sort of a hard and fast hours, like 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. seems like fairly reasonable, and maybe even making that weekend versus weekday, I'm not sure. Other than that, I think seems like we're all kind of on the same page on that.
Ms. Hulteen?
I forgot one thing. It hasn't been brought up in this discussion, but when I was doing research on this, there's a significant difference in travel of sound at different frequencies between 25 and 50 feet. So if we are going to use some sort of hard and fast measure, I would suggest that we go from 25 to 50 feet, because some things can both register at like 85 at 25 feet, and depending on what's making the noise, some of those will die down substantially by the time they get to 50. So I'd like to propose we adopt a measure of 50 feet for any hard measurements.
Ms. Hoppy?
Trying to wrap us up with a consensus. I believe that we have consensus to move forward with a hybrid approach, maintaining that industrial would be a zone that we would use decibels in. Potentially, I was gonna ask for C2 and C3 also, but maybe we just go with industrial and C3. But for now, I'm gonna ask for industrial. Hybrid approach, then we have time limits from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. 10 p.m., did I say? 10 p.m., sorry, 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. Thanks, Leah.
All noise.
And that we have call-outs sections for public events and special events. So like a special event would be the Carnation Festival, a public event would be live music on somebody's patio, that is specific towards outside amplified music, and that we look at the in the other areas of the hybrid, when we are just doing a qualitative, that we look at activities which are audible for 50 feet or more from the noise source or the property line. Can we have consensus on that?
Do you want to entertain any questions before we go
Sure.
to consensus? Or, okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the time frame. I heard 7.
7 a.m. to 10 p.m.
Okay, thank you.
And I think Ms. Weaver had a question.
I'd like to add to that, if you're amenable. You clarified public events and special events. I'd like there to be a third category of just someone's private event.
I would think that a private event would come under just neighborhood policing. So like if I'm having a party at my house and it's too loud, the cops come and say, hey, can you turn that down?
But I can see where I would hire a band to be at a party to play later than 10 with a permit process is
So
what
then could the
I'm
pub-
asking.
So then that would be a permitted
So
public
that
event.
is what you suggested. Okay, thanks.
I forgot to ask, sorry, before everybody raised their hands. We need to probably have some exemptions for construction. Where's my list? Construction, fireworks, loading operations, homeowner activities, and road improvements. So I'd like to add. Fire, police, yep. Exemptions. Okay, so I'd like to ask
All right, that
consensus for all
sounds
that
like
business.
an attempt. at
Fireworks
consensus.
where? They're illegal.
Like the Carnation Festival.
Before you take a consensus, can you,
Redo it?
well, no, just the piece on the, when you said call out public events, private events, special events, and then you said, now let's throw a permit process in there. Does everybody understand that?
That would be
or-
a permit process for those.
For what?
For what?
Amplified
Public
events
events,
or?
special events, which include outside amplified music.
So you'd need to have you'd need to have a permit to have your music on the patio.
On your special event or on your,
So
public
anytime a bar or restaurant on 38th or 44th wants to have a band, they have to get a permit? So is that what, I just want to make sure I'm understanding. Outside or,
outside, if it's outside.
this is similar to the 2012 ordinance, an amplified
Close to
permit
it.
process,
It's if they're outside.
if they're outside?
What if they were going like over 8 o'clock? I mean, I know that we have,
Is there a way to, and I don't know if the Carnation Festival, obviously they don't, I guess, like, if you're gonna go past 10 o'clock, you need to get a permit for that, or something like that, rather than, or, so if you're gonna be outside those or outside that time limit. Yeah, so if your band wraps up by 9:59 and they're done, it's fine.
Yes.
But if they go till 11, then you need that special use
Then you need a
permit
permit
or
for it.
whatever it is, yeah.
So it would be a permit for after normal hours.
Yes, for what doesn't happen within the 7 a.m. to 10 p.m.
And the way I was interpreting that, it was more of a permitted event or permitted special event would be exempted from the like the decibel level if we were to implement that.
Right,
Correct?
yeah, like how they do it in Arvadas.
Okay.
And we can discuss maybe some of the details when we bring this back, but, I mean, there's how many permits are allowed a year, blah, blah, blah. I mean, we have to get in the weeds of that, so we can discuss that later maybe, but.
Sure, I think if we have like a framework, then we'll be able to drill down some better discussion.
Okay. And did we have consensus then on that arrangement from everyone?
Consensus.
Okay, we do?
Thank you.
Do you think that gives you enough information to? Gives us a lot. Well,
Yeah, I think so.
We can bring back something with this, yep.
Okay.
And we can't have an ordinance necessarily drafted, but we'll bring something back.
we already got one in here.
Yeah, and maybe we'll use the 2012 and add to it.
Okay. All right, well, thank you very much for bringing that forward. I believe that concludes the business agenda items. We are now at item number 4, staff reports. Mr. Goff.
Yeah, just real quickly because of the hour. I'm not sure if you all received an email from RTD or not yet. We'll get this sent out to you tomorrow if you haven't. But they have made some, I don't think they're recommendations. I think they're what they're going to do on bus route cuts, and 30 to 32 is on their list, which is obviously goes down 32nd. They're gonna stop it at Wadsworth, and it'll go downtown still. But then they're actually going to stop it. It's not going to go further east. Right now, it goes all the way out to the zoo, and it's going to stop after downtown too. So they're going to maintain the 26th, but I believe RTD's having a study session on Thursday. So again, we'll make sure we get that information out to you. But I don't know if they're looking for feedback and they're going to change their mind, or if this is what they're just telling us they're doing, because they already did the public outreach and they did a survey, and the survey came back and said cut our services is what the responses were. I haven't had a chance to digest it fully, but we'll get some information out to you tomorrow on what the next steps are on that.
Okay, thank you. We will go to elected officials' reports. Anyone with an issue? Ms. Dozeman?
So since it came up this evening, can we maybe visit the fact that we have to have a permit in order to sled in the city of Wheat Ridge? Because I have always hated that, and when I was young, I went sledding and
I don't think we do.
definitely didn't pull a permit.
I don't think we at one point we didn't allow it because I think there was we had some safety issue. Yeah, but I think we've reinstituted it. I don't think we require a permit though. Check into it, but I don't know where that permit would be if we did.
I think it's at the discretion of the Director of Parks and Rec that they have to sign off on it.
Is it okay? Maybe it's
what I
part of the
remember.
Parks rules or something. Okay.
So next major snowstorm, Wheat Ridge PD is invited to come sledding with all the neighborhood kiddos. You go to the lemonade stand, so next time it's sledding.
Yeah, this
Okay.
is not an identified criminal justice issue that the police department is involved in.
We'll look into it and see what
All
the
right.
deals are and bring it back.
Thank you, Ms. Hoppy.
Patrick, could you send me as much information as you have as far as who I can contact at RTD? Because cutting the 32 before Kipling is a complete disservice to our high school. And if anybody ever drives by the high school in the morning or in the afternoon when they're getting out, like a ton of those students ride that bus to access school. And I know a lot of those kids are at risk. And so if we cut their path to school, then why even go? So if you could just let me know who to
Yeah,
get
again, we'll get some information out to you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Councilmember Hutchinson and I would like to bring forward a discussion around the creation of a Wheat Ridge Youth Council, and we can talk about that more at a later date, but that's something we want to bring up and have scheduled at some point in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional elected officials matters.
Given the hour, I will be uncharacteristically brief. When I create minutes for regular council meetings, they will be in the form recommended by the Colorado County Clerks Association by Robert's Rules of Order, which is to say they will be what we call action minutes. They will not contain the blow-by-blow, comment-by-comment descriptions that you have been used to reading over the last several years. For lack of a better term, the novella form of minutes. They will be brief action minutes. I would like for the council to think about what sorts of minutes you really want to have for these study sessions. We are among a tiny minority of municipalities and counties in the state that keep any minutes from study sessions. But I am acutely aware that the citizens are used to seeing minutes from these study sessions, even though now we have an electronic record of what everybody talked about and who said what. So I don't want to push people off of a cliff here. By the same token, on good advice of council and other municipal and county clerks, whatever you put into any kind of record, somebody will stand up in court and wave it at you if you're not careful. So taking into account the people that we all think about regularly who don't have a computer, who can't get access to these minutes by looking at it because they don't have cable TV, there are other ways those people can access the actual recordings and view them. If no other way, we will invite them to come to my office and we'll set them up at the terminal here in the lobby at City Hall and turn on the tape for them so that they can watch it. But I want you to think about how I should balance having too much information in the minutes and not enough, because these exhaustive novella-length minutes are non-standard. They're not in compliance with any regulation or any practice we know of anywhere else. But at the same time, they're not just my minutes. They are the council's minutes. So at some point, if each of you would speak to me and tell me what your thoughts are, I'll come back to the council and tell you, what sort of a solution we've come up with. My last comment is, for those of you who celebrate Christmas, have a very healthy and Merry Christmas. For those of you who celebrate Kwanzaa or Hanukkah or Arbor Day, have a great holiday season in peace and health. I am overwhelmed by the honor of serving with you people. Have a great holiday season.
Thank you. Additional elected officials matter, Ms. Hulteen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Mr. City Clerk, for that feedback. That definitely gives me something to think about. So I may have mentioned this previously, but since we have a little bit of a holiday and we don't meet again until January, correct? Yeah, wow.
January 6th.
2020, it's here almost. I am hosting a District 2 community potluck on January 11th. It's a Saturday night at St. James Church, and everybody is invited. You just have to bring some food to share. And we have some people who've lived in District 2 for a long time who are going to be telling stories of the district. And I'm going to be sharing out what I learned when I was campaigning and give District 2 sort of a preview of the big things ahead so that they're ready for what is looking to be an action-packed year. So 5:30 to 7:30 at St. James Church on January 11th, and everybody is welcome and all ages. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional elected officials matters. Seeing none, do we have one?
I have a quick update
Yeah,
on
a
quick
quick
update
update,
on sledding. Our
I saw this.
Our Parks and Rec Commission chair said sledding used to be legal until he petitioned to have it legal, so no permit is needed right now, according to our
Okay.
chair of our Parks and Rec Commission.
So all we need is a little snow on the ground then, you know, which.
Repealing code section 1754, which says sledding is prohibited with any park unless the director of Parks and Rec permits it.
Okay.
So that's what.
Well,
Do you want to break? Does that ordinance?
all right. Well, we are.
We haven't been enforcing that.
Okay. This is our last meeting of the year. I hope all of our citizens will have a very happy holiday and a safe new year. Watch out for all the students and young kids who are going to be away from school and out hopefully sledding and walking and snowshoeing in our city. So anyway, thank you all for being here. We will stand adjourned.